Hey guys, tonight we slip into the dim corridors of medieval birthing chambers, a place where the air is thick with smoke from tallow candles, and shadows leap across stone walls like nervous midwives. You tiptoe into this room with me, and the first thing you notice is the silence, then the sudden eruption of cries, groans, and whispered prayers. You're standing in a world where childbirth is both miracle and menace. And, spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive this without modern medicine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it in your part of the world? Drop it in the comments. I find it oddly fascinating to imagine all of us stretched across time zones, collectively dozing off to some shared medieval nightmare. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the birthing chamber, and immediately your senses are overwhelmed. The room is cramped, often no larger than a pantry, with walls sweating dampness from the stone. A heavy wooden door keeps men outside, because childbirth is women's territory, a liminal space where danger lurks. You catch the reek of smoke, mixed with herbs strewn on the floor in an attempt to purify the air. The midwife insists sage keeps away evil spirits, but honestly, it's doing little against the smell of fear and sweat. The mother-to-be lies not on a soft bed, but on straw, or, if she's wealthy, on a hastily padded mattress. Around her are women from the village, her mother, sisters, neighbors, all murmuring prayers to the Virgin Mary. The flickering candles cast jittery halos on their faces, giving everyone the unsettling look of saints or specters, depending on your imagination. You hear the clink of metal somewhere. That's the midwife preparing her tools, though you'd barely recognize them as medical instruments. A knife for cutting umbilical cords, strips of cloth for swaddling, and sometimes a birthing stool that looks like a three-legged chair with a hole in the middle. You wonder if anyone ever tested it for comfort. Spoiler, they didn't. The temperature in the room climbs quickly, partly from the fire in the hearth, and partly from the sheer panic radiating off the laboring woman. You notice her gripping a wooden cross, its edges worn smooth by years of desperate hands. It's not just faith, a lifeline. In an age when 1 in 3 women might die giving birth, religion is less about piety and more about sheer survival strategy. A cat darts across the room, and someone shouts to chase it out, fearing that its presence will curse the newborn. You roll your eyes, because, come on, it's just a cat. But remember, these people believe misfortune seeps in through cracks like smoke. If the candle flames flicker too much, it's an omen. Where if a dog howls outside, it means the child may not live long. This isn't just childbirth, it's a cosmic battle, and every detail is scrutinized. The sounds are relentless. Low moans break into sharp screams, followed by a collective hush from the women, as though silence can coax the baby out. The midwife dips her fingers in oil, muttering charms she half remembers from her grandmother. The smell of rosemary past you, bundled into the ceiling beams to guard against plague. You suppress a sneeze because, honestly, plague protection by potpourri doesn't sound especially effective. Still, there's a rhythm to it all, a strange coordination, like an orchestra without a conductor. One woman fans the mother, another massages her swollen ankles, Another sprinkles holy water. The midwife whispers instructions in a low tone, part encouragement, part command. You realize she's the unquestioned authority here, trusted with life and death, though historians still argue whether her knowledge was medical or mystical. You glance at the window, a narrow slit barely letting in any moonlight. Outside, men pace restlessly, excluded from the drama. They might be fathers, brothers, or priests, but their role is limited to prayer and waiting. Inside, the women create their own universe, cut off from the masculine world. It's a reminder that childbirth in this era is a domain of secrets, intensely female, fiercely guarded. The birthing stool is brought forward, and the mother shifts into position, supported on either side by two women. You notice her face is pale, glistening with sweat, and her breaths are short, ragged. The stool keeps her upright, gravity lending a hand, though it looks more like a medieval torture device than a medical aid. She clutches the arms of the women beside her as though they're ropes keeping her from drowning. You hear the midwife murmur, "Hush now, child of Eve," as though she's addressing not the mother but the baby. She reaches for her pouch of herbs, sprinkling something that smells earthy and sharp, perhaps pennyroyal, though it was as dangerous as it was popular. The irony of using poisonous plants to save a birth doesn't escape you, but in their minds, anything was worth trying. The room grows hotter, the air thicker, and you realize you're swaying slightly with the rhythm of the women chanting. It's hypnotic, part prayer, part lullaby, part plea. The sound rises and falls with the mother's cries until, suddenly, there's silence. You freeze, holding your breath with everyone else. Then comes a wail, thin, sharp, and unmistakably new. The women erupt into relieved laughter and praise, their relief palpable, their exhaustion equal to the mother's. The midwife ties off the cord with linen thread, then cuts it with her small worn knife. She lifts the newborn for all to see, inspecting limbs, checking for signs of deformity, or worse, omens. A child born with extra fingers might be whispered about for years, straddling the line between blessing and curse. Tonight, though, the child seems healthy, wrapped tightly in swaddling cloth. It looks more like a trussed-up loaf of bread than a human being. As you watch, the mother collapses back, her eyes rolling with fatigue, yet she clutches the swaddled baby as though holding a miracle. The women around her murmur blessings, crossing themselves, kissing her damp forehead. You hear one of them whisper that Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, must have been near tonight. Another insists it was the rosemary smoke, and you can't help but think maybe it was just sheer luck. Still, the chamber feels transformed. The oppressive air lightens, the fear drains away, and for a fleeting moment, you feel part of their triumph. This tiny, fragile child has slipped through the shadow of death into life, and the room, once heavy with dread, is now humming with quiet joy. But don't get too comfortable. Outside these stone walls, childbirth is still one of the most dangerous experiences a medieval woman will ever endure. Tonight, the story ends in survival. Tomorrow, it might not. And as you stand in the flickering candlelight, you sense how thin the line really is between cradle and grave. You linger in the chamber a little longer, and now your attention drifts toward the figure, moving quietly, almost ghost-like, among the women. The midwife. She is not just any woman. She is the keeper of whispered secrets, the one everyone calls When the labor pains begin, you notice how the others treat her with a curious blend of awe and suspicion. She is respected, yes, but also feared in a way that makes you think of how children regard thunderstorms. The midwife has a pouch strapped to her waist, and when she opens it, you catch the pungent smells of dried herbs, lavender, rue, pennyroyal, and maybe something you can't quite place, like crushed beetles or dried mouse tails. Don't laugh, it's entirely possible. Medieval midwives had recipes that sound like they were invented during a dare. But these ingredients were her arsenal, her version of anesthesia and antiseptic. Centuries before anyone dreamed of washing their hands with soap before touching. The women around her don't flinch, because to them it's normal. They believe she speaks not just to God, but to forces older, darker, and perhaps more flexible. Historians still argue whether midwives leaned more on folk magic or genuine medical knowledge. But here, in this cramped, smoky room, you don't see any separation. It's all one and the same. You watch her crush herbs in a small wooden bowl, with a pestle worn smooth from years of use. The paste she makes is rubbed on the mother's belly, supposedly to soften the womb. Is it effective? Probably not, but the rhythmic motion itself calms the laboring woman, which is its own kind of medicine. And if the placebo effect works today, why wouldn't it work then? The midwife also carries charms, small amulets, beads carved with saints, faces, or even teeth of animals strung together. She places one near the mother's head, whispering that it will trick the devil into looking elsewhere. You raise an eyebrow, but honestly, in a time when childbirth was more dangerous than battle, no one was turning down any form of insurance. No matter how eccentric, sometimes the midwife knows remedies passed down orally for generations. One such recipe involves boiling ale with fennel and anise to ease contractions. Does it work? Well, it's ale, so, if nothing else, it takes the edge off. You'd laugh if it weren't for the desperation in the room. These are not jokes to them, they are lifelines. You notice her hands, calloused, cracked, yet steady. Those hands have delivered more babies than you can count. And though she lacks a medical degree, universities barred women from such study. Her experience is encyclopedic. Still, she walks a tightrope. If too many mothers or babies die under her care, whispers begin. Perhaps she is cursed. Perhaps she is a witch. Perhaps, people say, she knows too much. The mother's relatives may know how to pray, but only the midwife knows how to massage a breech baby into a better position, or how to deliver twins when one gets stuck. You watch her listen intently to the mother's breathing, her face unreadable. She seems to sense the rhythm of the womb, as though she's tuned in to a frequency you can't hear. Sometimes she uses chant-sort, repetitive phrases that sound more like lullabies than spells. You realize they serve a double purpose, distracting the mother from her pain and creating a ritual that makes the unbearable seem bearable. Imagine trying to breathe through contractions while your neighbor sings off-key in your earl, right? Maybe not ideal. She inspects it, murmurs a blessing, and decides whether it should be baptized immediately. If the baby looks weak, there is no time to wait for a priest. She may baptize with whatever water is available, even a drop of ale in desperate cases. It's a reminder of how thin the line is between religion and necessity. Of course, her authority doesn't extend outside the birthing chamber. Beyond those doors, Men still decide her fate. If the child survives, she is praised. If not, she risks being accused of negligence or worse. Some churchmen write about midwives as if they're dabbling in sorcery, suspiciously independent women who wield too much influence. My money's on the latter. But hey, scholars love their debates. You also see her as a kind of community hub. She's not just delivering babies, she's carrying news, secrets, advice. She knows who's pregnant before the husband does. She knows which families are struggling, which ones are thriving, and who may have gotten a little too close to the blacksmith's apprentice. Knowledge is power, and she hoards it like treasure. And then there's her darker side, or at least the one people whisper about. If a labor ends badly, if a baby is born still or the mother dies, rumors swirl. Maybe the midwife used the wrong charm. Maybe she angered a saint. Maybe she secretly caused it. You notice how, even as she works, the women's eyes sometimes flicker with doubt, like they want to trust her but fear what she might represent. Yet she perseveres. You watch her move with calm certainty, a quiet anchor in the storm of screams and prayers. Her role is both sacred and precarious, both exalted and reviled. She is, in many ways, the embodiment of medieval contradiction, healer and suspected witch, nurturer and scapegoat. You realize she is also, unintentionally, the keeper of continuity. Without written manuals or medical schools for women, her knowledge is preserved only through apprenticeship, whispered mother-to-daughter teachings, and experience gathered painfully over years. One mistake, and her legacy might vanish. Watching her guide another laboring woman through waves of pain, you can't help but marvel. In an era where medicine often did more harm than good, she is the closest thing to hope. With nothing but herbs, prayers, and sheer determination, she pulls life from the jaws of death again and again. And while some will call her dangerous, others will call her indispensable. You step back, letting the scene blur a little. The chants fade, the herbs crackle faintly on the fire, and the midwife's steady presence becomes the heartbeat of the room. You wonder, for a brief moment, if modern hospitals, with their bright lights, sterile tools, and endless machines, will ever feel as intimate as this smoky chamber ruled by one woman with secrets in her pouch. And you realize, probably not. You drift now into the wider world beyond this smoky chamber, and your eyes adjust to the stark contrast between how childbirth looks for a noblewoman versus a peasant. You shuffle into a castle, and the stone corridors echo with the rustle of servants' skirts and the faint clink of goblets being carried upstairs. Here, childbirth is a stage, a performance, as much as a personal ordeal. You imagine yourself in a drafty chamber, high in a tower, tapestries flapping faintly, while the noble lady of the house groans on an oversized bed carved with saints and beasts. Her bedchamber is not empty like the peasant woman's cottage. Oh no, you see courtiers, ladies in waiting, sometimes even a priest or two, standing discreetly in the corner. Privacy, forget it. A noble birth is practically a public event because everyone's watching to make sure the air actually comes out of her body. You can almost hear the whispering. Is the child breathing? Is it a boy? Please, God, let it be a boy. The noblewoman isn't just giving birth, she's securing dynasties, and the difference in comfort, night and day. A peasant gives birth on straw or a wooden stool. A noblewoman lies beneath embroidered covers, clutching silk pillows. Yet oddly enough, both are equally vulnerable. No amount of luxury bedding will save her from hemorrhage or infection. You realize wealth is a flimsy shield here. The noblewoman's midwives are often better equipped, at least in theory. They have access to pricier remedies: saffron, myrrh, powdered pearls. Yes, they ground up actual pearls and fed them to women, because why not turn jewelry into expensive placebo powder? You almost laugh, imagining some medieval pharmacist saying, "Madam, swallow this crushed necklace. It'll help with contractions." If nothing else, it made the family feel like they were doing something. Meanwhile, peasant women relied on what they could grow or gather: chamomile brewed in weak beer, onion poultices for swelling, a sprig of rosemary tied to the wrist as protection. It's the herbal equivalent of duct tape, useful, cheap, and available to everyone. And the funny thing, sometimes the peasant remedies worked better than the expensive nonsense nobles indulged in. You shuffle back into the village now, peeking inside a low-roofed cottage. The walls are plastered with mud and straw. The hearth smokes heavily, and there's little space to move. The laboring woman here doesn't have silk sheets, but she does have neighbors' lots of them. Birth is communal. The whole hamlet might be on edge, waiting for the wail of a newborn. Outside, you can hear children running around, half excited, half terrified, whispering about whether the baby will live. In this small world, survival trumps ceremony. No one cares if the child is born with pomp. They just want both mother and baby to live. Still, traditions cling. A piece of iron might be slipped under the mattress to ward off evil. The local wise woman may stop by with a charm against the evil eye. And yes, you sigh, the cat gets kicked out again, poor creature. Cats never catch a break in medieval childbirth stories. Yet, surprisingly, you notice similarities between the noblewoman and the peasant. Both rely on midwives. Both fear death at every contraction. Both pray to saints like Margaret or Mary for protection. And both know that childbirth is the most dangerous journey a woman will take. There's a peculiar ritual among nobles you can't ignore. Sometimes high-born women gave birth in rooms specially prepared, all windows shuttered, doors sealed with wax, tapestries hung to absorb sound. Why? Because they feared wandering spirits or curses slipping in on a draft. Imagine giving birth in what is basically a velvet-lined panic room. You chuckle, softly modern soundproofing has nothing on medieval paranoia. In contrast, peasants gave birth wherever space allowed, by the hearth, in the loft, even in the fields, if labor caught them unawares. Yes, you picture it, a woman dropping her hoe mid-furrow, crouching down, and delivering a baby right there in the dirt. It sounds brutal, but life didn't pause for anyone. Babies came when they came, and wheat still needed harvesting. And here's the kicker: survival rates weren't necessarily better for nobles. You'd think with all their wealth they'd have an advantage. But wealthy women often had to endure more births because dynasties demanded heirs, preferably multiple sons. Each pregnancy chipped away at their health. So while a peasant might give birth to fewer children, a noblewoman was practically a baby factory. You shiver at the thought, realizing that luxury didn't always equal longevity. Of course, gossip traveled fast. If a noblewoman failed to produce a child or worse, failed to produce a male child, her position could crumble. She might be replaced, scorned, or blamed for things utterly beyond her control. You can almost hear the court whispering, maybe she's cursed. Maybe she angered God. Maybe it's her fault the child didn't live. The pressure must have been suffocating in the village. 2 rumors could turn deadly. If a peasant woman lost too many babies, neighbors might whisper about sins or witchcraft. They'd blame her diet, her morals, even the phase of the moon. You realize childbirth wasn't just physical. It was political, spiritual, and deeply social. One birth could elevate or ruin an entire family's standing. You lean against a beam in the cottage now, watching the exhausted peasant mother hold her baby. Her hands are rough from field work, her hair damp with sweat. Outside, her husband waits nervously, perhaps pretending to mend a cartwheel, though you know he's just listening for that first cry. When it comes, he exhales like a man spared from execution. For him, the baby is another mouth to feed, but also another pair of hands for the farm one day. Practicality beats sentiment 9 times out of 10 here. Meanwhile, back in the castle, the nobleman hears the news with entirely different stakes. If it's a boy, he celebrates with feasting and wine, throwing coins to servants, as if he himself did all the hard work. If it's a girl, the celebrations are muted, polite smiles plastered on faces hiding disappointment. The double standard is so sharp you can almost cut your finger on it. The candlelight flickers across both scenes, the gilded canopy in the castle, the smoky rafters in the cottage, and you realize that no matter how different the trappings, childbirth levels everyone. Power doesn't stop a hemorrhage. Wealth doesn't guarantee breath in a newborn's lungs. Whether on straw or silk, the danger is the same, and you can't help but smirk a little. All that pomp, ceremony, and crushed pearl powder, and in the end, the survival of mother and child depends on the same fragile roll of the dice. You think about that cat again. Maybe it wasn't such a bad idea to keep it around. At least it killed mice. The chamber grows quieter now, though not calmer, and you notice how the mother clutches at more than just the hands of the women beside her. Pain is no stranger. Here it stalks every corner of the room, and the tools to dull it are scarce, strange, and sometimes laughably misguided. You lean closer, and what you see is a mix of faith, desperation, and the occasional herbal cocktail strong enough to knock out a goat. The mother groans, her face pale, and one of the women presses a wooden cross into her palm. She grips it so tightly you wonder if splinters will outlast the memory of the labor itself. A whispered Ave Maria floats above the crackle of the fire, each word more for the comfort of the living than the ear of heaven. It's not hard to imagine why, when death hovers as close as life in childbirth, prayers are currency you spend freely, and the relics you see one woman tie a small cloth around the mother's neck. Inside it, a supposed shred of St. Margaret's veil, said to ease labor pains. Historians still argue whether midwives actually believed in these relics, or whether they used them as psychological tricks, but the fact remains, they were everywhere. A tooth of some obscure saint, a scrap of bone, even soil from a holy stone, paraded into the birthing chamber as though salvation came in pocket-sized packets. Then there are the brews. You watch as another woman lifts a clay cup to the mother's lips. The liquid is thick, bitter, and steaming it smells of beer mixed with ground herbs, maybe a touch of honey if someone was feeling generous. Fennel seeds float on the surface, and beneath it lurks pennyroyal, a plant so dangerous it straddled the line between medicine and poison. The theory: it stimulates the womb. The reality: too much of it might stimulate the grave. Still, you can't scoff too loudly. Even today, people will try strange teas and tinctures to coax along labor. The difference is, modern moms don't usually add, say, powdered emeralds to the mix. Yes, that was a thing. You imagine some medieval apothecary telling a nobleman, just shave a little off your wife's jewelry, stir it in, and presto, the baby slides right out. Talk about bling gone wrong. The candles sputter, and you glance at the birthing stool. The mother is shifting uncomfortably, and you realize the midwife is whispering instructions, urging her to breathe slower, to focus, to imagine the pain melting away. It's not exactly Lamaziette's, closer to a medieval guided meditation, but it does the trick. For a moment, the mother's breathing evens out, her face loosens, and she rides the contraction instead of fighting it. And then comes the chanting. Oh yes, the medieval version of a Spotify playlist. You hear women repeat rhythmic phrases, some biblical, some more like folk charms. Open, open, as the earth opens to the rain. The sound rises and falls, hypnotic, surrounding the mother. In a cocoon of words, it's part lullaby, part command. You can't help but think of modern white noise machines, except these come with a side of garlic breath and superstition. Yet, for all the prayers and potions, the reality of pain is undeniable. The mother cries out, sweat pouring down her temples, and you see her nails dig into her own thighs. One woman fans her with a goose wing, another dabs her lips with watered wine. There is no escape, only endurance. Pain is not a symptom here, it's the main character. Still, they try. A poultice of crushed poppy seeds mixed with warm milk is pressed against the mother's stomach. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't, but the idea of poppies has you raising an eyebrow. You know what's in them. Opium. Was medieval Europe dabbling in narcotics without realizing it? Possibly. Historians still argue whether midwives consciously exploited opiates or stumbled onto them by accident. But either way, it makes you wonder how many miracle births were just morphin-light moments. Of course, not every attempt is so subtle. One remedy involves placing the skin of a freshly slaughtered lamb across the mother's belly to transfer the pain. You shudder, partly because of the gore, partly because, let's be honest, that's just unsanitary. Then again, germ theory won't arrive for another few centuries, so to them, it probably seemed downright clever. And don't forget the charms muttered under breath. One particularly curious ritual involves drawing a circle of chalk around the bed, inscribing it with crosses, and forbidding anyone to step across during labor. It's both protection against demons and a way of making sure no nosy neighbor interrupts. Honestly, you kind of admire the multitasking. You also see the subtle negotiations happening in the room. The midwife balances folk remedies with Christian prayers, herbal brews with holy relics. She knows better than to lean too heavily on one side. Too much superstition, and the church will condemn her. Too much religion, and the women lose faith in her practicality. So she juggles both, and you realize she's not just delivering a child. she's delivering performance, reassurance, and leadership. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some women were encouraged to wear their husband's trousers during labor. Why? The belief was that the strength of the man would transfer to the woman. You snicker quietly, imagining a medieval noblewoman squeezing herself into oversized woolen breeches mid-contraction. Fashion statement? Maybe not. Symbolic? Absolutely. But the strangest ritual of all might be the use of keys. Yes, literal house keys, laid on the mother's thigh to unlock the womb. You're tempted to joke about it being the original life hack, but honestly, it's touching in its own way. They truly believed everyday objects held power, and when life and death hung in the balance, no superstition was too silly to try. As the contractions intensify, the mother's voice grows hoarse, her prayers dissolve into moans, and you see the women around her redoubling their efforts. The relic is pressed closer, the herbs replenished on the fire, the chanting louder, and you, watching quietly from the corner, sense how fragile hope feels in this moment, woven together by faith, herbs, and sheer willpower. The baby has not yet arrived, but already you understand something fundamental. Pain here is not an enemy to be eradicated. It's a force to be endured, sanctified, even partnered with. In medieval eyes, suffering was part of the process, a reminder of Eve's punishment, a trial that made survival all the more miraculous. And while you might wince at their crude methods, you can't deny the resilience it bred. You step back, letting the chorus of prayers and the smell of bitter herbs fill the chamber. Somewhere outside, the church bell tolls the hour, and you wonder how many other women in other cottages and castles are clutching crosses and sipping strange brews at this very moment. Pain is universal, and in the Middle Ages it was both feared and embraced, a sign of life's fragility and faith's endurance. And just as you think the room can't grow any heavier, the midwife reaches for her pouch again. The mother whimpers. The relic shines in the candlelight, and the whole chamber holds its breath. The line between agony and miracle stretches thinner than the thread that will soon tie off the cord. You notice the room shifting now, not in mood, but in focus. The midwife reaches for her bag, and suddenly it's less about herbs and charms, and more about objects crude, heavy, sometimes gleaming faintly in the candlelight. You lean closer, curiosity outweighing your squeamishness, because these are the tools of the trade, tools meant to coax life into the world, though to modern eyes, they look alarmingly like something from a medieval torture chamber. The first thing you spot is the birthing stool. Picture a three-legged chair, sturdy but awkward, with a large hole cut into the seat. The mother sits on it, supported by two women on either side, while the midwife crouches in front like a catcher in some grim, high-stakes game. The idea is simple. Gravity lends a hand, helping the baby descend. You almost want to applaud the practicality after all. Squatting is one of the most natural birthing positions. But when you see the stool's splintered wood, you wince. Comfort was never the design priority here. Some stools were padded with cloth, others carved with crosses or saintly images to ward off bad spirits. And, in true medieval fashion, some were decorated with grotesque faces meant to scare away demons. Imagine sitting on a chair with a demon's grin between your legs during labor. If nothing else, it's a distraction. Historians still argue whether the stool was widely used or more of a symbolic piece, but either way, it was a staple in the midwife's arsenal. Then there are not small, sharp, and unsettling. You realize they're not surgical instruments. In the modern sense, they're multi-purpose, cutting umbilical cords, trimming cloth for swaddling, sometimes even shaving wood to start a fire. But in the wrong context, they look menacing. The midwife handles them with a steady grip, careful not to alarm anyone, though you suspect every woman in the room knows the double-edged truth. A knife can bring life or hasten death. Beside the knives lie bundles of linen strips, neatly rolled. These are the unsung heroes to bind, swaddle, and sometimes to tie off bleeding wounds. Cleanliness is relative. They've likely been boiled, maybe even sprinkled with vinegar to purify them. You try not to dwell on how often they were reused. Let's just say medieval laundry wasn't exactly Tide Pod fresh. And then comes the truly alarming piece: crude forceps. Not the polished curved tools you might recognize today, but clunky iron tongs that look like they belong at a blacksmith's forge. You shiver, imagining the midwife using them to pull a reluctant baby into the world. Were they effective? Sometimes. Were they dangerous? Absolutely. Broken bones, crushed skulls, torn flesh, the risk was enormous. But when the alternative was losing both mother and child, you understand why desperate hands reached for desperate measures. You tilt your head and spot another tool, oddly delicate compared to the rest. A birthing girdle, made of parchment or silk, covered in prayers and holy images. It was tied around the mother's waist during labor. Less a physical tool than a spiritual one. It promised divine protection. You wonder if its real purpose was to calm the mother, more than to sway heaven, but either way, it belonged among the instruments of birth. Herbs to count as tools in this room. You see bundles of rosemary, thyme, and rue, strung near the rafters or tucked into pouches. They serve triple duty: fumigation, flavoring for those questionable brews, and talismans against evil. Some are even stuffed into pillows, so the laboring woman breathes them in while resting. Does it help? Maybe a little. At the very least, it makes the smoky chamber smell less like sweat and fear. And then there's the birthing belt, a long strip of fabric wrapped around the mother's waist and pulled taut during contractions. Think of it as a medieval version of pushing support. You can almost hear the midwife coaching: hold the belt, pull hard, push down. It gave the woman something to grip, channeling her energy downward. Honestly, not the worst idea, though the lack of ergonomic design might have left a few sore backs. Among the stranger tools are objects you wouldn't expect. Keys, again, to unlock the womb. Spoons laid across the belly, their concave shape thought to help scoop out pain. And occasionally, animal bones carved with runes, placed under the bed for luck. You shake your head, torn between admiration for their creativity and disbelief at their logic. But perhaps the most chilling tool is silence. The midwife knows when to hush the room, when to let the mother focus, when to quiet the nervous chatter of attendants. In an era without monitors or epidurals, silence itself becomes a kind of instrument, sharpening the senses, turning the chamber into a tense, vibrating bubble. You feel it, now the hush before a contraction, the way everyone leans in, waiting, holding their breath, as though that alone could tip fate toward survival. Of course, not all tools are physical. The midwife's memory is her greatest asset. She recalls how she turned a breech baby last winter, how she stitched a torn womb the summer before, how she saved one child with a warm bath and lost another despite her best efforts. No manual guides her, no textbook exists. Her mind is the library, her hands the instruments, her reputation the warranty. Still, you can't help but chuckle at some of the improvisations. Imagine a midwife rummaging in her kitchen for supplies, ladles, clothespins, even bread poultices pressed against wounds. Yes, bread softened and applied to infected areas. Was it sterile? No. Did it sometimes work? Strangely enough, yes, thanks to natural molds producing antibacterial effects. You half wonder if penicillin owes its discovery to some desperate medieval midwife slapping bread on a wound and muttering a prayer. And while you stand there, studying the array, you realize the irony. These tools, crude and frightening as they are, represent progress. They mark the beginnings of obstetrics, clumsy but earnest steps toward understanding childbirth. Without them, without the trial and error, without the painful experiments, we wouldn't have the safe, sanitized instruments we take for granted today. You step back, surveying the table where the tools lie, lit by flickering candlelight. To your modern eyes, they look dangerous, even barbaric. But to the people here, they are lifelines, hope forged in wood, iron, and faith. They are the difference between action and helplessness, between trying and surrendering. And you can't help but imagine yourself, centuries later, looking back at today's operating rooms with the same mix of horror and admiration. Would someone in the future laugh at our epidurals, our forceps, our fetal monitors? Would they call our methods crude, our tools primitive? Probably. It's the cycle of history. Today's lifesaver is tomorrow's nightmare relic. The birthing stool creaks, the knife glints, the forceps rest heavy and patient. The midwife's hand hovers, ready to choose. And you, watching from the corner, realize you're not in a torture chamber. After all, you're in a workshop of survival. You lean against the cold wall now, letting the hum of voices fade, and your thoughts settle on a truth the chamber cannot escape. Risk and mortality cling to childbirth here like smoke. It doesn't matter if the mother is a peasant or a duchess, whether the bed is straw or silk. The odds are brutal, and everyone in the room knows it, even if they don't dare say it aloud. The midwife wipes her hands on a cloth already stained from birth's past. She glances at the mother's face, ashen, jaw clenched hand. You sense her mind calculating. How long has she been laboring? Is the baby positioned well? Is there too much bleeding? For her, these aren't abstract questions, but immediate ones, with life or death weight. You can almost hear the statistics rattling around, though of course no one kept neat charts back then. But historians today estimate that in medieval Europe, as many as 1 in 3 women could expect to die from complications of childbirth over the course of their lifetime. Not in one pregnancy, but across multiple labors. Still, 1 in 3. You let that number sink in, and suddenly the prayers and relics no longer feel like quaint superstitions. They feel like desperate necessity. Infections alone were merciless. The very act of cutting the umbilical cord, if done with a blade rinsed in stagnant water, could introduce fever that burned through mother or child within days. There's no penicillin waiting in the cupboard, no drip humming at the bedside, just fever, sweating, hallucinations, and eventually silence and hemorrhage. The sudden, unstoppable flood was every woman's nightmare. You picture it now. A mother's life draining faster than anyone can stop. Linen cloths pressed uselessly against her body. Prayers muttered louder and louder, as though volume itself could staunch the flow. Some midwives tried herbal remedies, like shepherd's purse, to constrict blood vessels, or mixtures of red wine and iron filings. Sometimes they worked, often they didn't. You hear a cry from the laboring woman, a low moan that turns sharp. Her knuckles whiten around the wooden cross in her hand. Everyone leans in closer, not just to comfort her, but because they all fear this moment. One misstep, one complication, and hope evaporates. And it wasn't just mothers. Infants faced their own lethal lottery. Stillbirths were tragically common, and even when babies survived birth, they faced dangers in the first days, difficulty breathing, infections from dirty swaddling, or simply being too weak to suckle. Some mothers whispered that fairies had stolen their real child and left behind a sickly changeling. It was easier, sometimes, to blame the supernatural than to accept the cruel hand of chance. You notice how the midwife watches the baby once it's delivered, her eyes sharp, her hands checking every limb. Is the child crying strongly? Are its lips blue? She knows too well the signs of trouble. If it falters, she may baptize it immediately, using a drop of water from a bowl or even wine from a cup. Better a baptized soul in heaven than an unbaptized one lost in limbo. That was the logic. It's chilling, but in this world, theology and medicine are never far apart. Think about the father outside the door. He paces, maybe chewing his fingernails, maybe muttering his own prayers. He knows the stakes. He could lose his wife, his child, or both in the same night. Men might swagger in the fields or at the tavern, but in childbirth, they are powerless. Their futures hinge on the work happening behind that closed door. The sheer unpredictability gnaws at you. Sometimes, against all odds, a frail woman delivers. A robust baby with hardly a cry, and both thrive. Other times, a healthy, strong mother collapses suddenly, leaving behind a grieving family. Historians still argue whether diet, genetics, or pure luck played the greater role in survival, but no clear answer exists. Each birth was its own roll of the dice, and then there's the shadow of maternal mortality stretching across communities. You imagine walking through a village graveyard and noticing how many tombstones carry women's names alongside inscriptions like died in childbed or taken in travail. Entire families were reshaped by these losses. Children grew up motherless, fathers remarried quickly out of necessity, and newborns sometimes followed their mothers into the ground within days. Some households even prepared for it. Women might sew their own shrouds during pregnancy, just in case. You pause on that thought, but which might cradle her body before her child learns to speak. There's something heartbreakingly pragmatic about it, like packing a hospital bag today, except the bag doubles as your coffin lining still. Despite the constant threat, you can't help but notice the resilience. Communities adapted, leaned on each other. Neighbors brought food for the bereaved. Wet nurses stepped in for motherless infants, and widowers remarried quickly, weaving new families from the tatters of loss. It wasn't cruelty, was survival. Life had to move forward, no matter how much death tried to halt it. And yet, humor occasionally pierced the gloom. You overhear one of the attendants telling the laboring woman, half joking, that at least she won't have to haul water tomorrow. The women laugh, gently, and for a moment the room feels lighter. It's the kind of gallows humor you recognize instantly. Humans always make jokes in the darkest hours. You wonder if, centuries later, we're really so different. Back at the noble courts, mortality was no less present, though dressed in velvet. Queens died in childbirth as often as peasants did, their deaths altering the course of kingdoms. Consider how many wars, alliances, or dynastic struggles began with a woman failing to survive labor. It's staggering to realize that the fate of nations sometimes hinged on whether a midwife's herbs worked that night. And of course, when mothers died, blame was never evenly shared. Midwives risked accusations of incompetence or even witchcraft. Families whispered about curses or sins. Rarely did anyone say it was just biology. In their eyes, there always had to be a cause, a reason. Someone or something had to carry the guilt. You look again at the mother in this chamber, her body trembling, her eyes fluttering. You want to reassure her, to whisper that medicine will improve one day, that anesthesia, sterile tools, and antibiotics will change everything. But you can't. She is stuck in her century, and so are you, for now. All you can do is watch and understand why every prayer, every charm, every herb mattered so desperately. The wail of a newborn cuts through the air again, and relief floods the room. This time, both mother and child survive. Smiles break across exhausted faces, and the atmosphere lifts from dread to celebration in the span of a heartbeat. But you know, and they know too, that survival was never guaranteed. Tonight was a victory. Tomorrow, who knows? And that uncertainty, sharp, constant, merciless, is what defines medieval childbirth. Risk isn't just present. It is the very air they breathe, the rhythm of their lives, the shadow behind every cradle. You let that truth settle deep in your chest, heavy but undeniable. You linger in the chamber, and now your eyes shift toward the corner where a priest slips quietly inside. His robe swishes against the stone floor, and he carries a small satchel that smells faintly of incense. The atmosphere changes the instant he arrives. The midwife steps back a little. The women bow their heads, and the laboring mother, despite her exhaustion, presses the wooden cross tighter to her chest. The church has entered the room, and with it comes another layer of ritual protection, an expectation. The priest doesn't touch the mother. This remains women's territory. But his presence is heavy nonetheless. He begins to murmur prayers, his Latin syllables rolling like a low chant above the groans of labor. You notice how everyone relaxes a fraction, as though divine reinforcement has arrived. In a way, it has. The church in the Middle Ages wasn't just religion. It was insurance, medicine, and comfort, all rolled into one. Sacred protections surround the birth. A bowl of holy water is set near the bed, ready in case of emergency baptism. If the baby seems weak or dying, there is no time to wait for ceremony at church. The midwife herself, with whispered permission, may scoop up water in her cupped hand and pour it gently over the infant's head. In nomen Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. The words are said softly, but the weight is immense. Without baptism, the child is believed to drift in limbo, neither blessed nor damned, forever outside heaven's gates. The urgency is enough to make your heart tighten. You glance at the mother again. Her lips move as she mutters a prayer to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth. Legend has it, Margaret was swallowed whole by a dragon and burst out alive, making her a symbol of triumph over impossible odds. You can't help but smirk at the imagery. What better saint for a woman trying to push a baby through agony? If you're going to pick a heavenly advocate, choose the one who literally clawed her way out of a dragon's belly. Relics also make their appearance here. A strip of parchment covered with psalms might be tied around the mother's arm. A rosary may dangle across her swollen belly. In some cases, the famous birthing girdle is wrapped around her waist, covered in prayers written in red ink. The girdle's words promise safety, divine blessing, and a quick labor. Does it work? Well, historians still argue whether women actually believed in its power, or simply clung to it as a lifeline of hope. Either way, it is hard to ignore the comfort it brings. Outside, the church bell tolls faintly, reminding everyone that the spiritual world and the physical one are never separate. Birth isn't just biology here. It's a battlefield for the soul. The baby must be ushered into the world, not only breathing but sanctified, shielded from the devil who lurks at every threshold. You realize the birthing chamber isn't just a room, it's a front line. The midwife and priest form a strange partnership. She relies on herbs and hands-on skill. He brings holy oil and words of blessing. Occasionally, their roles overlap. In the rush of a complicated birth, a midwife may mutter both a charm and a psalm in the same breath. Was it faith or magic? To her, the distinction didn't matter. To the church, though, it mattered a great deal. Too much reliance on charms, and whispers of witchcraft could follow. Too little, and women might doubt her skill. She walks that tightrope carefully, and you admire the balance she maintains. You notice how much emphasis is placed on warding off evil spirits. Candles are blessed before being lit, their flames considered a shield against darkness. Crosses are drawn on the walls or the birthing stool. Sometimes iron objects, scissors, nails, even horseshoes are placed near the bed. Iron, people believed, had the power to repel demons. You almost laugh at the image of a noblewoman in labor with a horseshoe tucked under her mattress, but to them it made perfect sense. And then there are the whispered stories of infants cursed before birth. Perhaps someone envied the mother's fortune, or perhaps a witch was said to have hexed the family. To counteract this, the priest may sprinkle salt in the ruma, symbol of purity and protection. Salt was thought to keep demons at bay, though you wonder if it also kept the air a little fresher in these stuffy chambers. The mother cries out again, her voice cracking, and the women around her quickly launch into a familiar prayer. The rhythm of it blends with her groans, a strange harmony of suffering and supplication. You realize these prayers are as much for the women as they are for the laboring mother. Everyone in this room has seen or heard of births that ended in tragedy. Their voices are not just intercession, they're a way to steady their own trembling hearts. It's not only the living who are invoked. Saints, ancestors, even angels are called upon. Some women were encouraged to name their unborn child after a saint if survival seemed doubtful, in hopes of winning divine favor. You imagine a desperate whisper, "Call him John, after the Baptist. Maybe he'll live." It's superstition wrapped in devotion, and you find it deeply human. You also notice the strange duality of the Church's role. On one hand, it offers protection, blessing, and hope. On the other, it reinforces the idea that childbirth is punishment, the pain, a direct legacy of Eve's sin. The priest might even remind the mother of this in his prayers, though gently, as though saying, "This agony is your burden, but God will reward your endurance." Comforting. Not really, but it reflects how they saw the world. Suffering was not random but purposeful. There's even a debate among theologians of the time about unbaptized babies. Were they condemned? Were they simply excluded from heaven? Historians still argue whether the concept of limbo was more a scholarly invention or a deeply felt belief. But in this room, it doesn't matter. The fear is real enough that baptism is treated with urgency bordering on panic. And through it all, the priest keeps murmuring. His voice rises and falls, like a counterpoint to the cries and whispers of the women. You feel the strange tension of two systems colliding: medicine and religion, herbs and psalms, midwife and priest. Together, they create a fragile shield around the mother, as though layering protections like blankets. Then, for just a moment, the room quiets. The priest lifts his hand in blessing, tracing the sign of the cross in the smoky air. The mother, exhausted, leans back against her supporters. The relics glint in candlelight. The salt sparkles faintly on the floor, and you realize the birthing chamber has been transformed into something more than a room. It is a chapel, a battlefield, a sanctuary, and a crucible at once. And you, standing unseen in the corner, understand why faith was as important as forceps. When survival teeters on the edge of chance, people will grasp any rope offered to them, whether it's woven from scripture, relics, or iron nails. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief when the baby's first cry pierces the air, followed swiftly by a priest's prayer of thanksgiving. Life has arrived, and heaven has been invoked. Still, you can't help but smirk a little. If rosemary, relics, and rosaries could guarantee safe births, medieval Europe would have been overflowing with healthy mothers and babies. But here, faith is less about guarantees and more about courage. And perhaps that, in the end, was its greatest power. The chamber still smells of smoke and sweat, but your attention is tugged upward, now past the flickering candles, beyond the rafters, out into the night sky. Because for the people here, the stars themselves are part of the story of birth. You tilt your head back, and in your mind's eye you see the heavens sprawling above the medieval world. A map not of galaxies, but of fate. Astrology and omens weave their way into this moment as surely as herbs and prayers do. A laboring woman's relatives might whisper about the moon's phase. Was it waxing or waning? A waxing moon meant growth and health. A waning one suggested weakness or decline. If the baby came during a new moon, well, some believed that meant a life of renewal and beginnings. You can't help but grin, imagining the midwife pausing mid-contraction to step outside, squint at the moon, and announce, "Good news, ladies. He'll probably be ambitious." The stars, too, were consulted. Astrology wasn't fringe in the Middle Ages, it was mainstream, learned. Men, sometimes even university-trained physicians, cast horoscopes for noble births. The exact hour of delivery was noted, and charts were drawn to predict the child's destiny. Would he be a scholar, a soldier? Would she be devout, or perhaps dangerously stubborn? You almost hear the scratch of quills on parchment, the astrologer, hunched by candlelight, deciding a newborn's future before its first feeding. And then there are eclipses. You imagine the dread that would ripple through a village if a birth coincided with the sudden darkening of the sun. People saw eclipses as cosmic warnings, omens of misfortune or upheaval. A child born during one might be marked, destined for greatness or disaster. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed in such fate, or whether it was more a convenient story told afterward to explain unusual lives. Either way, eclipses loomed large in their imagination. Weather, too, had its say. A thunderstorm rolling over the roof during labor. That meant the child would be fierce and hot-tempered. Gentle rain. A life of peace, bitter cold, strength and endurance. A sudden stillness in the air, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. That was ominous, suggesting a fragile spirit. You realize now how the natural world, uncontrollable and mysterious, became a mirror for human hopes and fears. In the corner of the room, one of the attendants mutters about the way the candle flame flickers. She insists it's a sign that the child will be restless, maybe even mischievous. Another counters, saying it means the devil lurks too close. You chuckle under your breath. It's the medieval version of arguing over horoscope memes. Still, in this room, these beliefs matter. They help explain the inexplicable, give shape to uncertainty. Birds circling overhead could also be read as omens. A raven perched on the roof was a bad sign. A dove fluttering nearby was hopeful. And don't forget comets. To us, they're icy rocks. To them, they were blazing portents of doom. Imagine a noble woman laboring while a comet streaked across the sky. Whispers would spread instantly that her child was destined for turmoil. It wasn't only the sky that spoke. Household accidents could be read as signs. If a pot cracked during labor, it was said to mirror a difficult birth. If the fire burned too low, it foretold weakness in the child. And if the dog howled outside, well, better fetch more relics, because something ominous was afoot. One quirky tidbit you overhear in some regions. People believed that if a pregnant woman gazed too long at an animal, the child might resemble it. So, if she stared at a rabbit, the baby might be born with a hairlip. Or if she saw a black cat cross her path too often, the child might carry bad luck. You can't help but smirk at the absurdity. But then you remind yourself it was easier to blame a rabbit than to face the randomness of birth defects. The midwife herself isn't immune to these beliefs. You notice her glance toward the small window slit, checking the sky. She mutters something about the stars being favorable tonight. Whether she truly believes or simply wants to reassure the women, you can't tell. But the effect is immediate. Shoulders relax, prayers soften. In a world of uncertainty, even the illusion of cosmic approval brings comfort. Of course, scholars of the time tried to intellectualize these signs. Astrological manuals circulated, filled with diagrams and instructions on how to interpret planetary alignments. Physicians might use them to determine when to induce labor with herbs or when to hold off. Historians still argue whether these manuals were taken seriously or merely symbolic gestures. Yet nobles certainly paid good money for them. So belief must have run deep. And then there's the idea of fate itself. Many believed the moment of birth fixed a child's destiny. The position of the stars, the omens in the air, the behavior of animals, all of it wove together into a tapestry no one could unravel. Free will. That was a murkier question. You feel a chill, realizing how trapped they must have felt, thinking their lives were written before their first breath. Still, you can't help but admire the poetry of it, to look at the stars and see not just distant lights, but stories, warnings, promises. Sit makes the universe feel intimate, alive. And in a time when death hovered so close, maybe that intimacy was a kind of solace. The baby's cry pierces the room again, shrill and insistent. The women cheer softly, and one whispers, a strong voice, it means a strong life. The midwife nods, as though agreeing with the stars themselves. You shake your head, half amused, half moved. Whether or not the heavens dictate fate, the belief in their power gives shape to this fragile moment. And you realize, standing here, that omens and astrology aren't so far from today. People still check horoscopes, still read meaning into weather on wedding days, still make jokes about Mercury in retrograde. The medieval world simply raised those habits to sacred importance, weaving them into life and death events like childbirth. The candles flicker again. The night sky looms vast outside, and the newborn wriggles in its swaddling. You can almost hear the unspoken question hanging in the air. What destiny waits for this child? The answer to them is already written in the stars. The chamber has grown calmer since the wails of the newborn filled the smoky air, but the story doesn't pause. Your gaze shifts to a small wooden table against the wall, and on it rests a collection of jars, bundles of herbs, and bowls filled with unidentifiable powders. You lean closer, nose wrinkling. The pungent scents drifting off the table tell you that we are entering a world of folk remedies and bizarre concoctions, where faith, desperation, and creativity collide in strange mixtures that pass for medicine. You watch as the midwife stirs something into a clay cup. The liquid is dark, thick, and steaming faintly. It smells of beer, only not the crisp lager you'd pour into a chilled glass. Medieval beer is thick, cloudy, sometimes closer to porridge than drink. Into it she drops crushed fennel seeds and a sprig of rue. The mixture is handed to the exhausted mother, who grimaces but drinks. The idea is simple. Beer strengthens, fennel eases cramps, and rue well. Rue encourages the womb. Does it actually help? Maybe a little, but mostly it calms nerves and keeps everyone feeling like they're doing something. The remedies, though, can get weirder. One recipe calls for boiling a hare's liver and mixing the broth with honey to be drunk during contractions. Another suggests wearing the dried skin of a snake tied around the thigh, supposedly to draw out the child. You pause, stifling a laugh at the absurdity, but to these women, every scrap of animal or herb carried symbolic meaning. Rabbits meant fertility, snakes meant transformation, honey meant health. Mix them together, and you get what looks to us You see it drizzled into drinks, rubbed on lips, even smeared across wounds. Honey's natural antibacterial properties actually made it one of the more effective remedies. They had, though they didn't know why. They just knew it seemed to work. A crying baby might even be soothed with a honey-dipped cloth to suck on. You wince a little, yes. Medieval pacifiers were essentially sugar bombs, but you can't deny the ingenuity. And then there's animal fat. Goose fat is smeared on hips, thought to grease the passage. Pig fat is rubbed on the belly, as if lard alone could coax a baby outward. You shake your head at the image. Imagine covering yourself in bacon grease mid-labor. But the earnestness with which it's done makes you sober again. When choices are few, even lard looks like salvation. The strangest concoctions, though, involve powders from precious stones, ground emeralds, pearls, even sapphires, mixed into wine, then given to women in labor. The belief was that these gems contained hidden virtues, purity, strength, divine protection that could transfer to the drinker. You snicker quietly, imagining a medieval apothecary explaining that swallowing jewelry will ease contractions. But for noble families, no expense was too ridiculous if it promised survival. Not all remedies are swallowed. Some are worn. Amulets containing dried herbs or bits of parchment with holy words are tied around the mother's neck or wrist. One particularly odd charm involves carrying a piece of coral, believed to ward off evil spirits and bleeding alike. Another, even stranger, recommends placing the foot of a weasel under the pillow. You have to stop yourself from laughing aloud. Still, for people with no anesthesia, no sterilization, and little hope, superstition fills the void where science fails. Some remedies veer dangerously close to poison. Pennyroyal, tansy, and other herbs could ease cramps in small doses, but were deadly in large ones. Yet midwives still used them, walking the fine line between help and harm. Historians still argue whether these women understood the risks or simply relied on trial and error. Either way, every sip carried danger. You notice, too, how remedies vary between regions. In England, women might be given ale brewed with holy water. In France, saffron was prized for easing labor pains. In Germany, soot, scraped from chimneys, was sometimes mixed into drinks, believed to draw out bad humors. Grimaçoot tea sounds like a punishment, not a cure, but, for them, it was another tool in the chest. And let's not forget charms involving numbers. Odd numbers were thought powerful, so a mother might be given 3 sips of a potion, or a poultice might be applied 7 times. The repetition wasn't just ritual, it reassured everyone that cosmic balance was being honored. Even today, you notice how people cling to lucky numbers. Different century, same mindset. One quirky tidbit you can't resist mentioning. Crocodile dung was sometimes used in the ancient world as a contraceptive. By the Middle Ages, it wasn't as common in Europe, but the stories persisted. Imagine the rumor mill, oh yes, spread that on, no baby this year. It's absurd to us, but it reveals the extremes people went to in their attempts to control fertility and childbirth. You chuckle softly, remembering the earlier callback about the unlucky cat. 2. How remedies blend medicine with magic. A cup of spiced wine isn't just for strength, it might also be blessed by a priest. An amulet isn't only a charm, it might also contain ground herbs with real effects. In their eyes, There's no clear line between science and superstition. It's all one tapestry of survival. The midwife hands another mixture to the mother, this one smelling faintly of cinnamon and vinegar. It's meant to warm the blood and give energy. The mother sips, grimaces, and pushes forward. Around her, the women murmur encouragements, their faith bolstered by the belief that every swallow brings her closer to safety. And as you stand there, watching the jars and powders, you realize that what seems ridiculous to you was profoundly serious. To them, every strange concoction, every bizarre charm, was an attempt to wrestle back control from chaos. In a world where childbirth could so easily end in tragedy, even the strangest remedy was worth trying. You step back, the smells of herbs, honey, and fat mingling in the smoky air. The table of jars looks less like a collection of nonsense and more like a portrait of resilience. People reaching into the earth, the animal kingdom, even their jewel boxes, all in the desperate hope of keeping mothers and babies alive. And perhaps that hope, more than the remedies themselves, was the real medicine. The chamber has quieted again, and your focus drifts from herbs and relics toward the arrangement of bodies within the room. One detail strikes you immediately. Not a single man is inside. Fathers, brothers, even priests often linger outside, pacing nervously or whispering prayers, but the inner sanctum belongs entirely to women. You realize that childbirth here is not just a biological ordeal, but also a drama of gender roles: who is allowed in, who is excluded, and how responsibility is divided. You watch the mother groan on the birthing stool, sweat dripping from her brow, surrounded by a circle of women. The midwife crouches close, hands poised, while attendants fan her with goose wings or dab her lips with watered wine. Aunts, sisters, and neighbors murmur encouragement, their voices blending into a low hum. This is a female sphere, fiercely guarded with rituals and knowledge passed from woman to woman. The men, meanwhile, shuffle outside. You imagine them in the courtyard, trying to look busy pacing, sharpening knives, maybe pretending to fix a cartwheel, but their ears strain for any sound from the chamber. They are excluded, not just physically, but symbolically. To step inside would violate boundaries, would bring a masculine presence into what is considered a sacred female rite. Besides, most men would be useless in the room. They lack the knowledge, the composure, and frankly, the stomach for it. One of the women whispers something to the mother about Eve's curse, and you catch the way her tone wavers between sympathy and rebuke. It's a reminder of how society framed childbirth, pain as punishment for original sin. You smirk quietly at the unfairness of it all. Adam eats the apple, but women get centuries of agony. Even now, the idea lingers in the cultural memory. Yet, despite the blame, women carry not just the burden, but also the authority here. The midwife's word is final, and the attendants defer to her expertise. In this space, men have no say. For once, the patriarchal order pauses at the threshold, and power shifts temporarily to female hands. You can almost sense the solidarity, the strength drawn from shared suffering and shared skill. Outside, though, the father's role is not trivial. His anxiety is palpable. He needs an heir, especially if he is noble, and his household depends on the outcome. If the child dies, his lineage falters. If the mother dies, he may lose not just a wife, but also alliances, dowries, or even political stability. He paces because he is powerless, but also because the stakes are enormous. You overhear a muttered joke among the attendants. The men sweat more outside than we do inside. They giggle softly, easing the tension. It's the medieval equivalent of eye-rolling at husbands in delivery rooms today. Some things never change. Still, men aren't completely excluded from the story. Physicians, almost always male, occasionally step in, but usually only for noble women or in dire emergencies, and their presence is often resented. Physicians bring Latin books, theoretical knowledge, and sharp instruments. Midwives bring experience, intuition, and steady hands. The two worlds clash. Historians still argue whether male physicians truly improved outcomes or whether they often made things worse with their clumsy interventions. You glance at the midwife and suspect she'd answer with the latter. Then there's the symbolic role of men in the aftermath. Fathers name the child, though often influenced by saints' days or family tradition. Fathers present offerings at church for safe deliveries. Fathers boast if it's a boy and sigh politely if it's a girl. And fathers, of course, carry the authority to dismiss or defend the midwife if anything goes wrong. Their power is indirect in the room, but direct outside of it. You notice the gendered symbolism embedded in rituals, too. Women tie amulets or relics onto the mother's body, but these often belong to the husband or family patriarch. A man's belt might be draped across the woman's belly to transfer his strength. A house key from the father's bundle might be laid on her thigh to unlock the womb. Even in absence, men's objects are drafted into the ritual. It's as if the masculine presence is allowed in, symbolically, if not physically. The division extends to responsibility as well. If a birth succeeds, credit goes to God, to the midwife, sometimes even to the father's good fortune. If it fails, blame often falls squarely on the woman, the mother, for her supposed sins, the midwife for her supposed incompetence. Rarely does the father shoulder guilt. The gender roles here are not only divided, but also unequally weighted. Yet in this moment, inside the smoky chamber, you feel a flicker of female authority that is unusual for the time. The midwife directs, the women support, and the mother herself becomes the center of attention. For once, her body dictates the rhythm of the household, even the fate of the family. All eyes are on her, not as ornament, not as servant, but as the vessel of life itself. You step back in your mind, comparing it to the noble courts. There, the gender roles are even more staged. Noble women give birth in rooms full of female attendants, while male courtiers wait outside for the announcement of an heir. Sometimes, male physicians are admitted to ensure the legitimacy of the birth witnesses, to prove the child is genuine. Imagine the awkwardness of being watched in your most vulnerable moment by skeptical men scribbling notes. Privacy was sacrificed for politics. In peasant homes, the division is less formal, but just as firm. Men wait outside, women manage inside. Children may hover at the door, listening, catching glimpses of the mysterious world that shapes their family. In this way, gender roles are not only enacted, but also taught, passed down through silent observation. And yet, for all the boundaries, there are moments when the walls blur. If the labor goes on too long, or if the mother's cries grow too weak, the father may be called inside, not to help, but to say goodbye. You feel the weight of that image. A man kneeling at his wife's side, clutching her hand, while the midwife works desperately, already knowing it may be too late. In those moments, the rules of gender dissolve, and only raw humanity remains. You realize, too, that these roles reinforced broader social structures. Men owned land, fought wars, and held authority in courts. Women, in turn, carried the unacknowledged but essential power of creating heirs, sustaining families, and nurturing the next generation. Childbirth dramatized that division. Men outside with swords, women inside with swaddling cloths. Two worlds, each incomplete without the other, yet rarely overlapping. Still, you can't help but chuckle at the irony. Men strutted around as lords and warriors, but when it came to the most fundamental act of survival, the continuation of life, they were helpless bystanders, wringing their hands in the courtyard. The true battle was fought inside by women armed with herbs, prayers, and sheer endurance. The baby cries again, strong and insistent, and the women cheer softly. Outside, the father finally exhales, unaware of the details, only hearing the verdict of life. Inside, the midwife wipes her brow. The mother collapses in exhaustion, and the attendants exchange weary smiles. Gender roles may divide them, but in this moment, survival unites them all, and you, still leaning in the corner, recognize the paradox. Childbirth in the Middle Ages reinforced gender inequality, yet it also carved out rare spaces of female authority. In the smoky chamber, in the grip of contractions and prayers, women ruled. Their hands brought life, their knowledge guarded it, and their solidarity carried each other through. And even if the world outside forgot it quickly, inside this room, the truth was undeniable. Survival depended on women. The smoky chamber dissolves in your mind, and now you find yourself wandering beyond a single cottage or castle. You slip across landscapes, over mountains and rivers, into far-flung corners of medieval Europe, and even further afield, where childbirth traditions take on strange, sometimes startling variations. What surprises you is how many differences exist, and yet how many similarities echo from place to place, as though the fears and hopes of childbirth were a universal language. In England, you hear of women being confined to lying in rooms, where windows were shuttered and doors sealed with wax to keep out spirits. The chamber became an enclosed cocoon, stuffy and warm, with only women allowed inside. The belief was simple. Childbirth created a dangerous liminal space, a doorway between life and death, heaven and earth. Closing off the room wasn't just practical, it was spiritual insulation. You wrinkle your nose at the thought of laboring in an airless room thick with candle smoke, but to them, drafts carried demons as easily as cold air. Cross into France, and the emphasis shifts. Noble families sometimes arranged for elaborate churchings immediately after birth, where the mother, once considered ritually unclean, was reintegrated into sacred life with a formal blessing. Here, childbirth wasn't just private suffering, but also public reintegration. Women's bodies became both taboo and sacred, feared during labor and celebrated afterward. Travel further east into the Germanic lands, and you hear of curious charms involving knots. Pregnant women avoided tying knots in thread or rope, fearing it would tie up the baby inside. During labor, attendants rushed to untie every knot in the house shoelaces, purse strings, even knots in curtain cords, believing This would loosen the womb and allow the child to slip out freely. You smirk, picturing frantic women running around a cottage, untying knots, while the mother screams in the background. It sounds silly, but in their minds, every gesture could tip the scales of fate. On astrology, woven deeply into childbirth, physicians and midwives alike consulted horoscopes, carefully noting the planetary positions at the moment of birth. Families believed the child's destiny could be read instantly, written in the heavens. Imagine a baby's first cry, accompanied by someone muttering, "Ah, Mars is in the ascendant, he will be quick to anger." The infant hasn't even been washed yet, and already its temperament is decided. Then, across the Mediterranean, into Byzantium and beyond, you encounter practices borrowed from older Greek and Roman traditions. Midwives sometimes carried amulets, inscribed with prayers to Artemis, the ancient goddess of childbirth, even as they invoked Christian saints. The mingling of pagan and Christian rituals was common, though the church frowned upon it. You can't help but grin at the image of a midwife hedging her bets, muttering a Hail Mary with one breath and a hymn to Artemis with the next. Slide further into Eastern Europe, into the Slavic regions, and childbirth takes on a more openly magical tone. Women here might call on domovoi, household spirits believed to guard the home. Offerings of bread or salt were left at the hearth, hoping the spirits would shield mother and child from harm. You notice how practical items, bread for nourishment, salt for preservation, become sacred tools, blending daily survival with supernatural hope. And then, crossing into the Islamic world of the Middle Ages, the contrasts grow sharper. Here, childbirth is deeply tied to ritual cleanliness. Women bathe before and after, and prayers from the Quran are recited for protection. A newborn's first sounds might be the whispered call to prayer in its tiny ear, embedding faith in its very first breath. Remedies, too, differ. Honey is used not just as food, but as medicine, rubbed on gums or mixed into warm water for strength. You can't help but notice how honey, a universal symbol of sweetness and healing, appears across cultures, carrying similar hope in different tongues. Further east, in Jewish communities scattered across Europe and the Middle East, childbirth is guarded by prayers to ward off Lilith, the night demon believed to prey on mothers and infants. Protective amulets inscribed with holy names are placed near the bed, and verses from scripture are recited as shields. Historians still argue whether Lilith was more folklore than theology, but in these communities, the fear was very real. You glance again at the smoky chamber in your mind and realize how many invisible enemies medieval families felt they were fighting. Even within Europe, class differences carved traditions apart. In Scandinavia, peasant women sometimes gave birth while kneeling by the hearth, the warmest place in the home, while noble women reclined in canopied beds surrounded by attendants. In Spain, wealthy households employed physicians alongside midwives, creating a tense hierarchy of knowledge, where male learning often overshadowed female experience. Yet everywhere, from the fjords to the Mediterranean, the risks remained the same. Some customs sound almost whimsical. In parts of rural Ireland, a laboring woman was sometimes given butter churned from the family cow, both to strengthen her and to symbolically tie her to fertility and nourishment. In Hungary, a pot of warm milk might be placed beside the bed, representing abundance for the newborn. You smile at these small gestures, everyday food transformed into ritual. But there are darker practices too. In certain regions, women accused of witchcraft were sometimes suspected of interfering in births, causing miscarriages or deformities. Families, terrified of such curses, hired counter-witches to perform protective spells. It's a grim reminder of how suspicion poisoned communities, especially when misfortune struck repeatedly. You recall earlier how even cats and comets were blamed. Now you see how women themselves, particularly outsiders, became scapegoats. One detail you find particularly poignant: in some villages, when a baby was born alive and healthy, a piece of bread and salt was placed in its tiny hands. Bread for life, salt for preservation, and together they symbolized hope for endurance. Imagine a newborn's fingers curling weakly around those tokens. What a fragile, touching act of faith in survival. And then, in contrast, when babies were born still or malformed, whispers spread quickly. Some communities buried such infants outside consecrated ground, fearing they carried curses. Others baptized them urgently and buried them with small offerings, hoping to appease both God and restless spirits. It's haunting, but it reveals how deeply childbirth was entwined with belief about the supernatural. You realize, as you survey these varied customs, that while details differ, the pattern is the same. Everywhere, women rely on herbs, prayers, charms, and rituals to face the same primal fear that mother or child or both might not survive. Everywhere, families look upward to stars or saints, downward to herbs and earth, inward to faith and superstition, outward to community. The forms change, but the need remains constant, and, with a faint smile, you note that even in today's world, echoes linger. People still time births by astrology charts, still tuck lucky charms in hospital bags, still whisper prayers in delivery rooms. The modern beeping monitors may look nothing like the smoky chambers of medieval Europe, but the human urge to stack the odds, however irrationally, is timeless. You step back, letting the chorus of voices from across regions fade into one hum. From English shuttered rooms to Slavic spirits, from Islamic prayers to Jewish amulets, from French churchings to Italian horoscopes, the traditions swirl together like a tapestry. And the thread that runs through them all is clear. Birth was never just biology. It was always mystery, ritual, and fragile hope dressed in the garments of culture. The baby has cried, been wrapped in swaddling, and rests now in the crook of its mother's exhausted arm. But the story doesn't pause just because the child has arrived. In fact, you realize the first hours after birth are some of the most crucial, the most ritualized, and sometimes the most unsettling. You lean closer, watching how the attendants swarm around the newborn with a mixture of tenderness, suspicion, and superstition. This is infant care, medieval style. The first thing you notice is the swaddling. The child is bound tightly, arms pinned to its sides, legs wrapped straight, until it resembles more a loaf of bread or a cocoon than a human being. The belief is simple. Newborns are floppy, fragile, and unformed. Swaddling, they say, helps the body grow straight and strong, prevents limbs from bending the wrong way, and keeps the child safe from its own twitching. You wince a little at the sight. It looks suffocating. even a little cruel butt to them. A loose, unswaddled infant seemed at risk of deformity. Once swaddled, the baby is placed near the hearth to stay warm. In the chill of a stone cottage or castle chamber, warmth is survival. Some attendants rub the baby gently with warm cloths. Others stroke its forehead with a bit of oil. Olive oil in the south, animal fat in the north, whatever is available becomes a protective salve. You can almost smell the faint sweetness of oil mingling with the smoky air. But there's another step that startles you. In some communities, newborns are salted. Yes, literally sprinkled or rubbed with salt. The reasoning: salt purifies, wards off evil, and toughens the skin. In some texts, it's even said to prevent the flesh from rotting, as though the child must be preserved like meat. You grimace, imagining the sting on tender skin, but you realize the symbolism mattered as much as the practice. Salt was sacred, and so a baby entered the world through its touch. After salting, or in gentler homes, simply washing the baby might be passed briefly from hand to hand, examined closely. Are its limbs, even are its eyes, clear? Does it cry strongly? Each feature is scrutinized, because in a world steeped in omens, any irregularity carries meaning. A birthmark might be seen as a blessing or a curse. A crooked finger could foretell misfortune. Some families even whispered about changelings, the belief that fairies might steal healthy infants and replace them with sickly ones. If a baby appeared weak, restless, or malformed, suspicion grew. The poor child might be treated with extra rituals, or, tragically, neglected entirely. The mother, exhausted, drifts in and out of awareness, but she clutches the baby whenever it is placed back in her arms. Her bond is fierce, immediate, but also fragile. She knows everyone knows that many infants will not live beyond the first week. In some villages, families waited days before naming a child, fearing to attach themselves too quickly. You feel a heaviness in your chest, imagining parents holding back love, not out of coldness, but out of bitter caution. Still, care is practical as well as mystical. The umbilical stump is treated with ashes, vinegar, or even chewed up herbs, meant to dry it quickly and prevent infection. Sometimes a silver coin is bound over the navel with cloth, believed to ensure strength. The irony isn't lost on you. Precious metal strapped to a newborn, while its survival depends more on luck than wealth. Feeding, too, begins quickly. The ideal is for the mother to nurse immediately, but exhaustion, pain, or lack of milk may interfere. In those cases, goat's milk might be spooned into the child's mouth, or chewed bread softened with saliva. You cringe at the thought of pre-chewed bread passed into a newborn's lips, but it was considered nourishing. Again, practicality over disgust. And then there's baptism, looming always in the background. If the child looks weak, baptism is rush, sometimes within minutes of birth. A bowl of water, a muttered prayer, and the assurance that the soul will not wander unblessed. You feel the urgency in the women's movements, the desperation to secure spiritual safety before physical survival is even certain. In noble households, the newborn is displayed almost immediately, swaddled and carried before attendants or courtiers to prove legitimacy. The announcement of sex echoes down halls and courtyards. A boy, if fortune smiles; a girl, if not. Cheers or polite nods follow, depending on the verdict. For peasants, The announcement is simpler: a neighbor running to spread the news, children peeking into the doorway, a husband finally allowed inside to see what fate has granted. One curious ritual you witness: spitting. In some places, attendants spit lightly on the baby, not out of disgust, but as protection. Spit was thought to repel the evil eye, to guard against envy or curses. Imagine the scene: a newborn, barely hours old, swaddled like a sausage, and then ceremoniously spit upon by loving relatives. Strange, yes, but deeply sincere. And don't forget charms placed in the cradle, a sprig of rosemary or lavender to keep spirits away, a small cross of iron tucked beneath the mattress. In Slavic lands, red thread tied around the wrist to ward off envy. Each culture stitches its fears into these tiny gestures, layering protection upon protection, as though the baby were a fragile fortress under siege. You also see how quickly expectations form. A strong cry means vitality. A weak cry sparks worry. If the baby yawns, it is seen as a sign of peace. If it sneezes, someone rushes to say, "Bless you," fearing demons entering through the breath. Every twitch, every coo, every sigh is interpreted. In truth, the baby is simply being a baby, but in this world, every act carries cosmic weight. And then comes the first sleep. The infant is laid in a cradle, wooden, roughly carved, often rocked by a sibling's foot while the mother rests. The cradle may be lined with straw, wool, or rags, sometimes covered with a blanket embroidered with symbols for luck. You hear the soft creak of wood, the rhythm of rocking, the sigh of exhausted relief from everyone in the room. For a moment, the tension eases. The child is alive, the mother breathes, and the world feels stable. But beneath that peace lies unease. Everyone knows how fragile the coming days are. Fevers strike suddenly, breathing falters in the night. A cry may fall silent without warning, and so they cling to rituals, to swaddling, to salt and charms, not because they guarantee survival, but because they help people bear the unbearable uncertainty. You stand quietly as the baby stirs, its face scrunching, its tiny lips searching. The midwife nods approvingly. This is a good sign. She mutters a blessing, maybe a charm, then straightens her back, satisfied for now. The women settle around the mother, some tidying, some whispering stories of their own children's first hours. The chamber, once a battlefield of screams and prayers, softens into something like a nursery, and you realize, with a pang, that despite the salt rubs, the spit, the bread mush, the fear of changelings, the essence is the same as today. The first hours after birth are filled with awe, exhaustion, and desperate hope. Parents hold their breath, marvel at tiny fingers, and pray, whether to God, the stars, or sheer luck, that this small bundle will keep breathing into tomorrow. The room has softened into a hush, the newborn swaddled tightly, the mother drifting between pain and relief. You glance around the smoky chamber and realize that even in these first hours, decisions about nourishment are already pressing. Breastfeeding seems obvious to you, but in the medieval world, it wasn't always that simple. Customs, class. People thought milk was essentially transformed blood, the very essence of her body. If the mother was virtuous, her milk made the baby virtuous. If she was sinful, her milk might corrupt the child. You pause, realizing how heavy that burden must have felt, every sip a moral judgment. every drop an inheritance of character. But reality rarely matched ideals. Many mothers died in childbirth, leaving infants hungry within hours. Others were too weak, too ill, or simply unable to produce enough milk. In noble households, mothers often didn't nurse even if they could. Breastfeeding was seen as undignified, interfering with beauty, and perhaps most importantly, with fertility. A noble woman's job was to produce heirs, and constant breastfeeding delayed new pregnancies. Both tool and servant, she nurses not just with her breast but with her reputation. Families scrutinize her character, her diet, even her habits. Whether these anxieties were exaggerated or whether families truly believed personality could be transmitted through milk. But you watch the way noble parents study the wet nurse, and you realize it doesn't matter. Belief itself gave milk a moral weight. In peasant households, things looked different. Most mothers nursed their own children because hiring a wet nurse was a luxury they couldn't afford. Yet even here, alternatives existed. You can almost imagine the whispered network of women. "My sister just gave birth," was common, though difficult for infants to digest. Sometimes bread was chewed and softened into a paste, pushed gently into the baby's mouth. Other times, a rag soaked in cow's milk was tied into a knot and given to the child to suck. You shiver at the thought of bacteria festering in unwashed cloth. But survival left no room for niceties. And then there were the beliefs about timing. Some insisted that breastfeeding should not begin immediately, that the first milk was too thick and dangerous. Until the real milk arrived, you sigh, knowing how much protection those infants lost, yet understanding how powerfully belief shaped action. Wet nurses themselves carried contradictions. They were valued, even essential, yet also stigmatized. But gossip always followed. Scandals brewed when wet nurses seemed to wield too much influence, their milk-making them surrogate mothers in more than just function. You recall stories of kings and princes raised more by wet nurses than by their own mothers, creating bonds that shaped politics as much as families. In some cases, a noble child might even treat the wet nurse's children as foster siblings, ties that later influenced alliances or feuds. Milk, it seems, created not just nourishment, but networks of loyalty. In everyday life, breastfeeding was also regulated by superstition. Women were told not to nurse after strong emotions, anger, fear, lust, lest the milk transmit those feelings to the child. Diet mattered too. Garlic, but to them, the connection was undeniable. There were also strange remedies for boosting milk. In some regions, women wore charms shaped like breasts, or drank wine infused with herbs to call the milk down. You grin, thinking of it as the medieval version of lactation cookies, just with more questionable ingredients. One particularly odd custom: some mothers rubbed butter on their breasts, believing it would make milk flow more freely. Others placed warm bread poultices across their chests. Bread was both food and tool, a constant companion. Wet nurses, meanwhile, followed strict codes. Children sometimes suffered neglect, as the nurse prioritized the noble infant. You feel the quiet tragedy in this one mother's body sustaining another's child at the expense of her own. Yet for all the rules, contradictions, and risks, breastfeeding by mother or nurse remained the lifeline. You watch as a peasant Mother lifts her baby to her breast, the child latching clumsily. Relief floods her face, exhaustion softens into tenderness. You see the same scene in a noble chamber. Fathers had opinions, bitter herbs on the breast, distracting the child with toys, or even leaving it briefly with relatives to break the habit. Each culture found its own way to mark the transition, often with as much drama as the birth itself. And as you watch the newborn suckle, whether from mother, nurse, or ragu, realize again how fragile survival is. Each sip carries hope, each swallow a victory. Behind every ritual, every superstition, lies the same desperate truth. Without nourishment, no child lives. The baby feeds, drifts into its first fragile sleep, and the chamber exhales a collective sigh. But the rituals aren't over. Even in exhaustion, families turn quickly toward the next step, bestowing a name. You settle into the corner, watching the quiet flurry of whispers and decisions, and realize how much weight a single word can carry in this world. It is survival, honor, and faith, all tied up in syllables. The most immediate concern is baptism. In villages and cities alike, a child might not be officially named until it was baptized. Sometimes this happened within hours, especially if the baby looked weak. Imagine the urgency. A newborn swaddled, rushed through smoky streets to a church. Priest waiting with a basin, family hovering nervously. The name is pronounced over water before the child has even taken its first steady breaths. To die unnamed, unbaptized, was unthinkable. For stronger babies, the ritual could wait days, sometimes weeks, but the choice of name was never left to whim. In many places, it followed the calendar of saints' days. If a baby was born on St. Margaret's feast, she might be called Margaret. Born on St. John's Day, John it is. This wasn't just convenience, it was insurance. By tying the child to a saint, families hoped to bind divine protection to their fragile lives. You hear the midwife murmur that to repeat a family name was to honor the dead, to keep their memory alive, and to secure continuity. Imagine a boy named after a revered warrior uncle. How many times would villagers remind him of the shoes he had to fill? For noble families, naming was political as well as spiritual. An heir might be named after a king to signal loyalty, or after a saintly figure to polish the family's reputation. A name could cement alliances, flatter patrons, or assert claims to power. You can almost hear courtiers debating, should we call him Richard, after the king, or Louis, to please the French court? Even in infancy, politics crept into the cradle. In peasant homes, the logic was simpler, but no less meaningful. You smile faintly, thinking how modern parents do the same, searching baby name websites for meanings like warrior or light. Some things never change, but not all names carried blessings. Superstition crept in some regions. If a family lost several children in infancy, they might name the next one unwanted or known name, hoping to trick death into passing it by. You feel a shiver at the thought, child growing up under such a name, a living plea to fate. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or rare, but the stories alone reveal the desperation behind naming choices. You notice that gender plays a decisive role. Boys are often named after saints, prophets, or ancestors, ensuring lineage and authority. Girls, though not neglected, are more likely tied to virtues or Marian devotion. Mary Ann, Hope. Their names, like their roles, are meant to reflect piety and modesty. Yet, exceptions exist. Some noblewomen bore fierce names, recalling queens or legendary figures, as though families secretly hoped for daughters with fire in their blood. Once chosen, the name becomes public. In villages, neighbors gather quickly, congratulating or gossiping, judging the choice. Was it too ambitious, too humble, too foreign? Names marked identity as sharply as clothing or accent. A child named after a foreign saint might invite whispers of divided loyalties. A name too plain might suggest poverty of imagination or of ambition. You see, too, how names connected families to wider spiritual networks. To bear a saint's name meant sharing in their feast days, their prayers, their intercession. Parents prayed not just to God, but directly to the child's namesake, asking, Saint Catherine, guide our little Catherine. The link was personal, almost contractual. A name was not just a label. Some families gave a child a second, secret name, whispered only at home, as extra protection. The idea was that evil spirits couldn't harm the child if they didn't know its true name. You grin, imagining medieval parents juggling aliases for their toddlers like spies in a folktale. Silly, maybe. But in their world, it was another shield against loss. The midwife finally leans close, suggesting a name softly, almost deferentially. She has seen too many children die. She knows which names carry luck, which families have prospered, which saints seem to listen more closely. Her voice carries weight, and often her suggestion is heeded. In this way, her influence extends beyond birth into the very identity of the child. Meanwhile, in noble courts, scribes stand ready to inscribe the chosen name into records, ensuring legitimacy. Announcements are made, feasts planned. If the baby is male, if female, the celebration is smaller, but still meaningful. Even here, the weight of expectation lies in a name. Imagine a courtier muttering, another Margaret. The family already has 3. But repetition was deliberate, tied children to traditions too strong to break. And then comes the moment of proclamation. The priest dips his hand into water, sprinkles the infant, and declares, I baptize thee. The name resounds in the smoky chamber, in the church, in the fields where neighbors whisper. From that instant forward, the child is not just flesh and breath, but identity, marked by both family and heaven. The mother, the father outside repeats it, already imagining how it will sound, shouted across fields or echoed in taverns. A name once spoken embeds itself everywhere, weaving the newborn into the fabric of community. And you realize something subtle but powerful. Names. They are chosen for the family, the church, the community, even the cosmos. Again, it seems to glow faintly in the candlelight. Not just a word, but a shield, fragile yet fierce. Whatever the world holds, sickness, famine, war, the child now carries a name to walk with, to protect it, to anchor it in a world of shadows. And you, listening quietly, sense the timeless truth. Names have always been more than sounds. They are stories condensed into syllables, history tied into breath. In this smoky medieval chamber, the ritual feels heavy, urgent, almost desperate. But across centuries, in quieter hospitals today, parents still lean close to whisper first. Names over their infants. Hope, honor, survival. it all begins the same way. The newborn now has a name, whispered like a charm in the dim chamber. But your attention shifts again. You realize how every step so far has been a dance between two worlds, one of faith and folklore, the other of hands-on skill and practical medicine. You linger in this tension because here lies one of the great struggles of medieval childbirth, the tug-of-war between medicine and superstition. The midwife sits on a low stool, her pouch of herbs and charms spilling open at her feet. She is the perfect embodiment of this duality. With one hand, she prepares an herbal infusion, poppy and fennel, steeped in warm ale, a concoction that soothes pain and steadies the mother. With the other, she fingers a relic tied around her wrist, muttering a half prayer, half incantation. To her, there is no contradiction. Healing comes from earth and heaven, from root and relic alike. But the world outside the smoky chamber isn't always so forgiving. Male physicians, trained in universities, sneer at midwives, charms, and chants. Their books, filled with theories of humors and astrological charts, condemn folk remedies as dangerous nonsense. And yet, these same physicians prescribe treatments that make you cringe, bloodletting a laboring woman to balance her humors, or giving her powdered gemstones to strengthen her womb. You can't help but shake your head. Which is really more effective, the goose fat rubbed on a belly, or the ground sapphire stirred into wine? Historians still argue, and you realize the line between science and superstition was blurred on both sides. One fact stands out. Medieval medicine leaned heavily on Galen's theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Every illness, every complication was blamed on an imbalance of these fluids. If a woman bled too much, she was said to have too much blood. If she labored too long, maybe her humors were cold and needed warming with hot wine or baths. Physicians wrote endless treatises on these theories, but in practice, little of it helped in the chamber. The midwife's hands-on knowledge, crude though it seemed, often saved more lives than Latin textbooks. Yet midwives, too, walked a risky path. Their use of charms, iron keys, saintly girdles, whispered prayers was tolerated as long as it overlapped with Christian ritual. Step too far into pagan incantations, and they risked accusations of witchcraft. You picture the midwife you've been watching, crouched over her herbs, carefully weaving a prayer to Saint Margaret into her chant, just enough to keep the balance. She knows survival depends not only on skill, but on perception. And then there are the remedies that straddle the boundary. Take rue, for example, an herb both medicinal and mystical. Physicians recommended it for womb disorders, while villagers used it to ward off evil spirits. Or take holy water, blessed by priests, yes, but also sprinkled in ways more magical than liturgical. The same object shifts meaning depending on who wields it, a fluidity that fascinates you. One quirky tidbit you overhear. In some places, if labor stalled, women were instructed to walk around the church 3 times, then crawl under the altar. Was this medicine or superstition? Neither and both. Movement can indeed help reposition a baby, but crawling under sacred space turns the act into ritual. You grin at the absurdity, but also marvel at the accidental wisdom hidden in these practices. Superstition sometimes went darker. If a baby was born malformed, neighbors whispered about curses, demons, or parental sins. Physicians, meanwhile, blamed maternal imagination, the idea that a mother who gazed too long at a strange animal or thought sinful thoughts had imprinted deformity on her child. You groan inwardly at the cruelty of it, but it shows how medicine and superstition alike often turned blame back on women, and yet, despite the nonsense, seeds of genuine progress existed. Some physicians recommended washing hands before attending births, not out of germ theory, but because cleanliness pleases God. The side effect: fewer infections. Some midwives swore by boiling linens, not because they understood bacteria, but because fresh cloth drove away bad humors. Accident or not, these practices saved lives. You realize that even flawed reasoning can stumble toward truth. The conflict between midwives and physicians wasn't only about methods, it was about power. Midwives held authority within their female spaces. Physicians, barred from those chambers unless invited, resented that exclusion. They published treatises claiming to know more, often filled with diagrams of wombs shaped like jars or horns, but their knowledge was abstract, theoretical. Midwives had dirt under their fingernails, experience carved into their hands. The tension was inevitable. Book learning versus lived practice, status versus survival. You can almost imagine the arguments echoing through villages. A noble family calls a physician who prescribes a regimen of purging and bloodletting. The midwife rolls her eyes, insists on warm compresses and prayers. The family hesitates whom to trust. If the child dies, blame will fall somewhere. If it lives, credit will be claimed. Medicine and superstition entangled in rivalry, but both desperate for the same goal. Sometimes the balance leaned too far. A physician's intervention with sharp instruments could cause more harm than good, yet his authority carried weight. Conversely, a midwife's reliance on charms could delay practical help. The truth is messy, full of trial, error, and human stubbornness. Historians still argue which side did more good. Standing in this smoky chamber, you suspect the answer is both on. Neither. One more example lingers in your mind: cesarean sections. In rare, desperate cases, physicians attempted them, usually only after the mother had died, to save the child. Survival rates were abysmal, yet stories circulated of miraculous saves, fueling both medical curiosity and superstitious awe. To families, it was less a medical procedure than an act of divine intervention. Medicine and miracle blended until they were indistinguishable. You glance again at the newborn, swaddled tightly, its small chest rising and falling. To us, it seems absurd that charms, relics, and humors could govern care. But to them, it was all they had, a patchwork of faith, fragments of knowledge, and desperate hope stitched together into something like medicine. The mother sighs, her eyes heavy but alive. The midwife adjusts her pillows, offers her a sip of broth, then turns back to tidy her herbs. In that simple act, you see the balance laid bare. Broth for strength, herbs for healing, prayers for protection. Medicine and superstition, working side by side, neither strong enough alone, but together just barely enough to tip life toward survival. And you realize, as you watch, that this tug-of-war didn't really end in the Middle Ages. Even now, hospitals hum with monitors, while people still tuck charms into pockets. still whisper prayers, still check horoscopes for due dates. The stage is brighter now, the tools cleaner, but the script hasn't changed all that much. We are still trying to weave science and faith into a net strong enough to catch fragile life. The chamber feels almost restful, now the baby swaddled, the mother dozing, but beneath the fragile peace lurks a darker reality. Not every birth ended with survival, and when things went wrong, blame followed swiftly. You watch as the midwife glances toward the door, wary. She knows too well that failed births can lead not only to grief, but to accusations, punishments, and whispered suspicions that cut deeper than any knife. The first form of blame often landed on the mother herself. If the baby was stillborn, neighbors might whisper that she had sinned during pregnancy, that she quarreled too often, or ate forbidden foods, or thought impure thoughts. Some believed that a woman who gazed too long at a fire could scorch the unborn child, or that she had angered God by neglecting prayers. You frown, recognizing the cruelty in this logic, grief compounded by shame, as though misfortune were always deserved. Midwives, too, lived under the shadow of suspicion. Their role gave them both authority and vulnerability. If they succeeded, they were praised as angels. If they failed, they were eyed as witches. The herbs they used, the chants they muttered, the relics they carried, all could be reframed as evidence of sorcery if outcomes turned sour. You can almost hear the gossip around village wells. Too many mothers die with her. Perhaps she serves the devil. The punishments varied. Some midwives were simply dismissed or shunned, forced into poverty. Others faced trials before church, courts, accused of negligence or witchcraft. And while not every accusation ended in burning stakes, the fear alone was enough to keep them treading carefully. Every birth they attended was not only a struggle for life, but also a test of their reputation. You think of the noble courts, where childbirth carried political weight. If a queen or duchess failed to produce a healthy heir, blame could be devastating. Families might accuse her of witchcraft or infertility, or even of deliberately harming the child. There are records of noble women humiliated, cast aside, or sent to convents when they failed to deliver. A king could annul a marriage, citing her inability to provide sons, and the woman would bear the stain forever. Imagine the suffocating pressure, each contraction carrying the weight not only of life, but of dynasties. Among peasants, the punishments were less formal, but no less cruel. A woman who lost multiple infants might be avoided, her touch feared as unlucky. Neighbors could refuse to share food or labor with her family, believing misfortune was contagious. Sometimes, mothers accused themselves. I must have angered God. The self-blame became another layer of suffering on top of loss. You overhear a darker whisper: infanticide. In desperate circumstances, famine, poverty, shame, some newborns were quietly smothered or abandoned. The church condemned it fiercely, branding it a mortal sin, but the fact that sermons railed against it shows it happened. When such deaths occurred, blame and punishment could fall harshly, especially on poor women already marginalized. Sometimes, guilt was assumed without evidence, and tragedies of stillbirth were twisted into accusations of murder. Then there's the strange logic of curses. If a baby was malformed, villagers might suspect that someone had cursed the family. Perhaps a jealous neighbor, perhaps a wronged lover, Perhaps a witch hiding in plain sight. Protective rituals, salt, iron, relics suddenly became retroactive defenses. Too little, too late. The blame sought a target, and in the absence of clear answers, it usually landed on women. Historians still argue whether witchcraft accusations were truly widespread in medieval childbirth, or whether most women were trusted. Records show both. Communities relying deeply on midwives, while simultaneously fearing them. The paradox is striking: revered and reviled, healer and suspect, praised today and condemned tomorrow. You imagine the psychological toll. Every time the midwife crouched beside a woman in labor, she carried not only the burden of saving 2 lives, but also the dread of what might happen if she failed. Every stillborn child wasn't just tragedy, was potential evidence. And yet, she continued, because someone had to. That resilience, you realize, borders on heroic. Even punishment for mothers could take bizarre forms. In some regions, women believed that a difficult labor or failed birth was divine judgment for not confessing sins. Afterward, priests might insist on penance, fasting, pilgrimages, or offerings to churches. Sometimes, women were barred from entering holy spaces until purified through ritual. Instead of compassion, they received stigma, branded as spiritually tainted. Quirky customs reveal this tension. In parts of Europe, women wore special birthing girdles, inscribed with prayers. If a mother died, families sometimes accused her of failing to wear it properly, as though negligence in ritual, not medical reality, sealed her fate. You sigh, recognizing how rituals that once comforted could so easily be twisted into blame. At noble courts, blame was weaponized politically. A rival faction might spread rumors that the queen consort practiced dark arts, that her failed pregnancies were curses upon the realm. Entire wars have roots in such suspicions. Imagine a royal mother enduring loss, not only privately but publicly, her grief dissected by courtiers as political ammunition. And then there's the father's role in blame. Rarely was he accused. If the child died, he might grieve, but suspicion almost never touched him. His seed was considered beyond reproach. The inequity is stark, and you can't help but mutter to yourself, convenient, isn't it? Women bore both the risk and the guilt. Their bodies both battlefield and scapegoat. Yet, amidst the shadows, you catch glimpses of resilience. Families sometimes defended their midwives fiercely, insisting she had done all possible. Communities rallied around grieving mothers, bringing food, offering prayers, reminding each other that fate cannot always be controlled. Even punishment could be tempered by compassion when neighbors recognized their shared vulnerability. After all, no household was immune. Everyone knew tomorrow's misfortune could be theirs. Still, the specter of blame never disappeared. Lingered in every relic tied around a wrist, every charm muttered under breath, every priest summoned to bless a bed. These rituals weren't only for protection, they were insurance against accusation. If tragedy struck, families could say, "We did everything: salt, prayer, relic, charm. God chose otherwise." Rituals, you realize, shielded reputations. As much as souls, the baby stirs in its swaddle, whimpers softly, and the women rush to soothe it. Relief floods the room again, but you sense the fear lurking beneath. This time, mother and child survived. Next time, they may not. And if they don't, punishment will follow: social, spiritual, perhaps even legal. You stand in the smoky air, watching the exhausted midwife tidy her pouch, and feel a pang of admiration. She knows too well that her profession is perilous, not only because of blood and fever, but because of blame. Yet she returns, again and again, stepping into rooms where life and death balance on her hands, knowing that survival earns her fragile gratitude and loss earns her suspicion. And you realize, as you drift back into the rhythm of the room, that childbirth in the Middle Ages was not just about survival, it was about accountability in a world desperate for answers. When fate seemed random, people invented reasons. When medicine failed, they turned to morality. And when tragedy struck, punishment often fell hardest on those who least deserved it. The fire in the hearth has burned low, casting the chamber in dim orange light, but your thoughts wander beyond this single smoky room. You drift into the world of records, testimonies, and ink-stained parchments, where the debates of scholars and churchmen circle endlessly around the figure of the midwife. She stands at the crossroads of history, part healer, part caretaker, part suspect. And as you listen, you hear echoes of arguments that still stir modern historians. Were medieval midwives saints or sinners, guardians of life or dabblers in forbidden arts? You start with the obvious. Midwives were indispensable. They knew how to massage a breech baby into position, how to swaddle firmly, how to calm a laboring woman with songs or charms. Many lived long lives of service, remembered with affection by neighbors. In local memory, they were the backbone of survival. But written records, especially those left by men in power, often tell a different story. Physicians, eager to carve out their own authority, painted midwives as ignorant, dangerous, even deceitful. They claimed women relied too much on superstition, that they endangered mothers with risky remedies, that their lack of university training made them unfit for responsibility. Purging or gemstone powders, hardly safer than the midwife's honey and herbs. Still, in the tug-of-war for authority, midwives became easy targets. Churchmen added their own suspicions. Some praised midwives for baptizing infants in emergencies, saving souls in critical moments. Others condemned them for straying into magic, for whispering charms that sounded too pagan, for wielding influence outside the control of priests, of using childbirth as a cover for heresy. Historians still argue. You imagine leafing through dusty court records, seeing the names of women dragged before judges, accused of maleficium, evil magic. Some were midwives who had lost too many patients. Some were outsiders, widows without strong protection. Some were simply unlucky, present at tragedies that demanded explanation. The charges often included grotesque tales, midwives smearing ointments, speaking with animals, or muttering incantations as babies struggled. You know, of course, that much of it was slander. But in their world, fear turned easily into accusation. Not all records are hostile. In certain cities, midwives were officially licensed, recognized as necessary professionals. In parts of France and Germany, they swore oaths to serve faithfully, to baptize infants when needed, to avoid superstition. These documents suggest respect as well as control. Some argue they were respected community leaders, wielding influence through their knowledge and networks. Others suggest they were always on the margins, tolerated but never secure, vulnerable to shifts in mood or politics. The truth, likely, lies in between. In some villages, midwives were beloved pillars. In others, they were convenient scapegoats. What fascinates you most is the blend of reverence and fear. Neighbors entrusted midwives with their most intimate moments, their most fragile hopes. Yet the same neighbors could turn on them when death struck. It's as though society projected all its contradictions, faith and fear, trust and suspicion. The figure of the midwife. She embodied survival, but also the mysteries people didn't understand. One quirky detail you find in records: some midwives were rumored to possess cauls, the membranes occasionally borne over a baby's head kept as lucky charms. These were believed to protect against drowning or misfortune, and sailors sometimes bought them for steep prices. Was this commerce or superstition? Both, and it shows how midwives straddled the line between healer and magical practitioner. You think of the scholarly debates still raging. Was the witch craze of the later centuries already brewing in these suspicions of midwives? Some historians argue yes, pointing to their association with female knowledge and secret rituals. Others insist midwives were more often allies of the church, baptizing infants, reinforcing Christian values. The records are inconsistent, fragmentary, open to interpretation. And so the debate continues, centuries later, as fiercely as ever. Meanwhile, in the smoky chamber of your imagination, you picture the midwife tidying her tools, exhausted but resolute. To the women around her, she is no witch, she is savior, guide, anchor. They owe her their lives. Whatever scholars write, whatever inquisitors fear, the reality in these rooms is clear. Without her, survival is slim. Still, you can't ignore the paradox. She is both essential and expendable, trusted and distrusted, praised and punished. Her reputation depends not only on skill, but on luck, on outcomes she cannot always control. Midwives mirrors something broader, the clash between lived experience and institutional power. Communities trusted the women who had delivered their children. Authorities trusted only themselves. Midwives lived in the gap, carrying knowledge. That was oral, embodied, passed through touch and practice, not ink and parchment. It was knowledge invisible to universities, but visible in every saved mother. Midwives versus Dr. Secco. These medieval tensions. The questions are old, the battleground the same. Even if the tools have changed, the midwife finally closes her pouch, tucks it under her arm, and glances once more at the baby sleeping in its swaddle. She knows tomorrow someone may praise her as a saint or whisper that she flirts with sorcery. But tonight, in this candlelit room, she has done her duty. The fire has dimmed to embers, and the newborn sleeps soundly in its swaddle. But the story carries you out of the chamber, down echoing halls, and into the glittering yet precarious world of courts and castles. Here, childbirth is not only personal, it is political. You sense the weight of dynasties pressing against the fragile body of a queen or noblewoman, her labor determining the fate of entire kingdoms. In the countryside, a birth means another worker for the fields, another mouth to feed. But in palaces, a birth means alliances, succession, treaties, and wars. A male child is a treasure, an heir to secure land and power. A female child is a bargaining chip, a future marriage to cement alliances. And a stillbirth, or worse, a string of them can topple thrones. You shiver, realizing how medieval politics were literally written in the blood of childbirth. Imagine the scene: a queen in labor, confined to her chamber with ladies-in-waiting midwives and priests. Outside, the king paces, not just with worry, but with calculation. If the child is a boy, his dynasty strengthens. If a girl, he must rethink alliances. If the queen dies, he may remarry for political gain. Her screams are more than agony. They are echoes in the corridors of power. Consider England, where the Wars of the Roses raged partly because of disputed heirs. One stillborn child, one sickly prince, one queen's infertility, each triggered cascades of conflict. Or think of France, where noble houses arranged marriages at birth, treating newborns as pawns on a vast chessboard. In courts, a baby's sex was not just personal joy or disappointment. It was a political verdict. You notice how ceremonies reflected this weight. When a prince was born, church bells rang across towns, feasts were declared, and coins were thrown. To the poor, when a princess arrived, celebrations were muted, sometimes bordering on embarrassed silence. You shake your head at the unfairness: infants, judged by their chromosomes before they could even open their eyes. Yet, for rulers, dynasties depended on sons. The political role extended to the mother, too. A queen was judged not only by her piety or beauty, but by her fertility. Her body was a vessel for heirs. A string of healthy sons made her revered. A string of miscarriages or daughters made her vulnerable. Kings could cast aside wives deemed barren, sometimes through an sanctioned by the church, sometimes through exile. Imagine the terror of each pregnancy. Knowing your place at court could vanish with a single failed birth. And then there's the spectacle of noble childbirth. Unlike the secrecy of peasant cottages, royal births were semi-public events. Witnesses were often required not to help but to verify. They confirmed that the child was legitimate, that no substitution occurred, that the queen truly delivered the heir herself. You feel the suffocating lack of privacies creaming in pain, while courtiers hovered, watching for signs of fraud. Yet, in an age of political intrigue, such precautions were deemed necessary. One bizarre tradition you hear whispers of: sometimes, noble women gave birth in elaborately prepared chambers lined with tapestries, shutters nailed shut, fires kept roaring even in summer. The reasoning was part spiritual, part practical. Warmth was thought to aid labor. Darkness protected against spirits. But also, the confinement symbolized the gravity of the act. The queen was not simply a mother, she was producing the kingdom's future. The stakes are clearest when heirs are scarce. Consider Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's queen, who suffered multiple stillbirths and infant deaths. Each loss was not only personal heartbreak, but a national crisis. The absence of a male heir eventually fueled England's break with Rome, reshaping European history. You marvel grimly. One woman's womb altered the fate of continents. Even in lesser courts, childbirth shaped politics. A baron might arrange marriages for daughters before they could walk, securing alliances with neighboring families. A healthy, son-ensured inheritance of lands, preventing disputes. An unhealthy child, or none at all, left property vulnerable to seizure. The midwife's work, you realize, had ripple effects far beyond the birthing stool. And when politics turned desperate, so did measures to secure heirs. Strange remedies proliferated, fertility charms blessed by priests, pilgrimages to saintly shrines, concoctions of herbs mixed with precious metals. Women prayed at the tombs of saints, begging for sons. Some even sought out relics said to guarantee fertility, bones of holy women, belts once worn by saints. Did they work? Probably not, but the stakes were high enough that no remedy seemed too strange. When births failed politically, blame often shifted swiftly. Queens were accused of witchcraft, adultery, or divine disfavor. Whispers poisoned courts. Perhaps she cannot bear sons because she sinned. Or, in darker tones, perhaps God himself rejects this marriage. Kings sometimes used such excuses to discard wives, claiming their infertility proved the union cursed. You see how childbirth became weaponized. Women's bodies were pawns in dynastic struggles, their success or failure measured only by the survival of heirs. Compassion was scarce. A noble woman might be mourned if she died in childbirth, but her legacy was counted in sons, not in her suffering. And yet, amidst this harshness, moments of tenderness peek through. Chronicles tell of kings weeping openly at the death of infants, of queens writing prayers for unborn children, of courtiers rejoicing sincerely at the cries of a healthy baby. Politics did not erase humanity. It simply layered heavy burdens on top of it. There is also the role of wet nurses in politics. Noble children often grew up closer to their nurses than to their biological mothers, creating bonds that sometimes influenced future alliances. A king might trust a man because he was the son of his own wet nurse, bound by milk kinship. You smile faintly at the irony. Political loyalty, flowing not through treaties but through breastfeeding. Historians still argue whether noble women accepted their political role with resignation or with quiet resistance. Some queens embraced fertility as power, boasting of their many children. Others resisted by sponsoring religious or artistic endeavors, carving identities beyond motherhood. But in the birthing chamber, resistance was nearly impossible. The body was destiny, and destiny was political. You stand now in the grand halls of a castle, tapestries fluttering, servants rushing. Somewhere behind closed doors, a woman labors, her screams echoing faintly. Outside, courtiers wait, holding their breath, not only for life, but for power. The moment the midwife steps out and announces a son or a daughter, the future shifts. Treaties may be sealed or broken. Wars may ignite or be prevented. The fate of peasants, armies, and kingdoms rests in the cry of one fragile infant. And you realize, with a shiver, that medieval childbirth was not only a personal ordeal of blood and pain, but also a political gamble. Thrones, titles, and borders depended on women's bodies, on the survival of tiny lungs and fragile hearts. Every cradle was also a crown. Every lullaby was also a treaty. And every midwife, crouched at the edge of a noblewoman's bed, was not just delivering a child, she was delivering the future of a kingdom. The castle corridors fade, and you slip now into the realm of stories, half history. In hushed whispers and illuminated manuscripts, you realize quickly that these stories shaped how people thought about childbirth, just as much as herbs or midwives did. The most common were tales of saints. Saint Margaret of Antioch, already invoked in countless birthing chambers, was said to have survived being swallowed whole by a dragon. When she burst out of its belly unharmed, she became the perfect symbol for women enduring labor, trapped inside pain, but emerging with new life. Mothers clutched her relics, wore girdles inscribed with her prayers, and called on her name mid-contraction. Some chronicles even record miraculous escapes from dangerous births credited to her intervention. To the women gasping on birthing stools, Margaret wasn't a distant figure in stained glass. Pilgrims visited her shrines, hoping her intercession would ensure safe deliveries. Stories circulated of barren women who conceived after praying at her relics. Whether true or not, the belief spread, offering comfort to countless women who feared their wombs might stay empty. But not all tales were uplifting. Limbs, or with strange markings. These were not seen as medical anomalies, but as signs, omens of sin or divine displeasure. A child born with fused legs might be called a mermaid child, a portent of disaster. A baby with two heads was whispered to embody a family's hidden sins. You feel a chill, realizing how such children were often hidden, abandoned, or at best treated as living warnings. One quirky tidbit surfaces from the Chronicles of Matthew. Paris, a 13th century English monk. He wrote about a woman giving birth to a child covered in hair, which he interpreted as a sign of unnatural lust. Today you'd shrug and call it a case of lanugo, a harmless condition. But the stories reveal how tightly biology and morality were knotted together. Miraculous births also colored imaginations. Some children were said to emerge, speaking, or with teeth already grown. In hagiographies, the biographies of saints' mothers, often felt no pain at all. Their labors eased by holy intervention. You smirk at the exaggeration. Tales hovering between folklore and propaganda. Kings sometimes claimed miraculous births for their ancestors as proof of divine right. From the womb, you grin at the absurdity, but you see the pattern. Even birth was weaponized for legitimacy. Folk tales add another layer. In some villages, women whispered about changelings sickly, children swapped by fairies for healthy ones. If a baby cried too much or failed to thrive, suspicion grew. Families might leave the child briefly on a hillside, hoping the fairies would return the real infant, to force the fairies to undo their trick. The tragedy beneath these stories is hard to miss. Weak or disabled infants. The desperation to explain. Without modern science, every unusual birth became a sign, a symbol. A two-headed calf in the barn, a stillborn infant in the cottage, both were read as cosmic messages, warnings from God. The world itself seemed to speak through bodies, and birth was its loudest language. You lean closer to the mother in your imagined chamber. She listens as attendants recount old stories. A neighbor whose baby was born silent until a priest prayed. A cousin who swore Saint Margaret appeared in a dream before her child arrived safely. These tales circulate not just as entertainment, but as reassurance. They tell women they are not alone, that their suffering fits into a bigger pattern of miracles and mysteries. Monastic writers also contributed, though often with a moralizing tone. They describe difficult births as punishment for sin, easy births as rewards for piety. You can almost hear a monk's voice intoning solemnly, her agony purged her sins. Her child is her crown, comforting. Some popular ballads celebrated miraculous survivals, turning them into songs sung at feasts. Hope that every child might carry hidden greatness. One debate lingers in the scholarly world. Did villagers really think a hairy baby proved lust, or was it just a story repeated to explain the inexplicable? Historians still argue, but in the end, belief mattered less than impact. Whether literal or metaphorical, the stories shaped how communities responded, how mothers were judged, how infants were treated. And perhaps most telling are the small, quiet stories passed not by monks but by mothers. You hear a woman whispering that she felt her grandmother's spirit beside her during labor, guiding her through. They ripple through generations, shaping expectations and comfort. The baby stirs again, mewling softly in its swaddle. Is this face ordinary enough? They measure the child not only by flesh, but by story. You realize how inescapable it is. Every birth becomes legend. Every infant a canvas for meaning. And you, standing unseen, see the truth. Stories were survival. As much as herbs or relics, they gave shape to fear, offered hope in the midst of agony, explained tragedy when medicine could not. Without them, the chaos of childbirth would have been unbearable. With them, mothers and families could at least pretend the universe was listening, that their suffering fit into a grander design. The chamber grows still again, the baby breathing softly, the mother drifting in and out of sleep. The midwife finally leaning back against the wall with tired eyes. And as you stand there, unseen, you feel the story itself slowing. It isn't ending, not exactly, but settling into reflection. Because what lingers after the cries and prayers and rituals is not only the memory of one night. You begin to notice which legacies of medieval childbirth have faded, and which, surprisingly, still echo faintly in modern life. First, the obvious, survival rates. The medieval gamble of 1 in 3 women dying over their lifetimes in childbirth is no longer our daily reality. Hospitals, antibiotics, sterile tools, these have transformed the battlefield. You almost sigh in relief, as though personally spared. And yet, you also recognize how fragile safety can still be, how in some corners of the world, echoes of medieval risk remain. The shadow hasn't vanished everywhere. Midwives, once half-healers and half-suspects, remain central figures today, though their reputation has shifted. In many places, they are respected professionals, trained alongside doctors, armed with knowledge their medieval sisters could never dream of. Yet the intimacy remains. Even now, many women prefer midwives for the sense of closeness, of being guided by someone who stands at their side rather than above them. That legacy female solidarity in the face of panendures. Rituals linger too, though in softer forms. The birthing girdle, inscribed with prayers, may be gone, but lucky charms still slip into hospital bags. Saint Margaret may no longer be invoked by name, but mothers still whisper prayers, still call on saints or ancestors. Some wear necklaces blessed by faith leaders. Others tuck small crosses or stones into their palms. You grin faintly. Centuries later, people still hedge their bets, layering science with superstition, naming practices to echo across time. Families may not tie names strictly to saints' days anymore, but they still seek meaning honoring ancestors, signaling values, hoping names will shape destiny. and the same pride or disappointment still greets the announcement of a child's sex, even if softened. You realize how powerful those medieval frameworks remain, reshaped but not erased. Even swaddling, that breadloaf binding of limbs, has returned. Modern parents, wrapped in sleep-deprived desperation, swaddle babies tightly to soothe them. The reasoning differs now. It's about calming reflexes rather than preventing crooked bones. But the result is the same: a cocooned child, snug and silent, echoing centuries of practice. You chuckle softly, imagining a medieval mother nodding in approval at today's neatly wrapped infants. And then there's the tension between medicine and tradition. Medieval mothers balanced herbs and relics. Modern ones balance epidurals and natural birth, hospitals and home births. The debates sound different, but feel eerily familiar. Who holds authority? Whose knowledge counts? The arguments rage on, echoing those old clashes between midwives and physicians. Even political stakes survive, though in quieter tones. In some monarchies, royal births are still spectacles, their announcements global news. The future of dynasties may no longer hang so directly on heirs, but fascination remains. People still crowd around palaces or, more often, television screens to hear whether the baby is boy or girl, to speculate about names, to watch history written in nurseries. The medieval court chamber has been replaced by glossy press releases. But the gaze of the world is just as intense. But some legacies have faded, thankfully. The brutal punishments for failed births, the cruel accusations of witchcraft, the shunning of grieving mothers, these no longer haunt most societies. Mothers are no longer forced to bear sin as explanation for tragedy. Still, you note, subtle traces linger in the way women today are judged for their choices. Too young, too old, too medical, too natural. The language has changed, but the scrutiny persists. Historians still argue whether modern judgment is gentler, or just cloaked in new words. You glance once more at the newborn, tiny chest rising and falling. In medieval days, its life would still be precarious, survival not guaranteed. Today, we celebrate births with less fear, but the awe remains. Every infant still represents continuity, hope, possibility, and that, you realize, may be the most enduring legacy. The sense that each birth, no matter the era, is both miracle and gamble. Think of the echoes that bind centuries together. The father pacing outside, powerless. The mother gripping hands, teeth clenched, whispering prayers or curses. The midwife, steady and calm, guiding through chaos. The relief when the cry finally pierces the silence. These scenes play out in different rooms, with different tools, but the emotional core is timeless. And then, softer legacies, the stories. Medieval mothers pass down tales of saints and dragons, miracles and monsters. Today, parents pass down birth stories with equal fervor. The long labor, the last-minute rush, the strange details that become family legend. Maybe no one invokes changelings anymore, but families still weave myth into memory. You were born during a storm. Someone will tell a child, and the thunder stopped the moment you cried. The details shift, but the instinct is the same, to wrap the rawness of birth in narrative. You reflect on one final detail: solidarity. In smoky medieval chambers, women circled one another, holding hands, chanting, fanning, massaging. Today, doulas, nurses, partners, and friends form similar circles. Pain is endured communally, not alone. Perhaps that is the most precious legacy. Of all that birth remains a shared ordeal, binding people together in ways that transcend centuries. The mother sighs, turning her head slightly, eyes fluttering closed. The baby twitches in its swaddle, then drifts deeper into sleep. The midwife straightens, stretches her stiff back, and finally allows herself to smile. Around them, the chamber is quiet. Fear has not vanished, but for tonight, hope has triumphed. And you, still standing in the corner, realize your journey through medieval childbirth is complete. From smoky chambers to saints and omens, from relics to politics, from superstition to medicine, you have seen how life began in an age when death was never far away. You have heard the cries, smelled the herbs, felt the tension, and glimpsed the fragile miracle of survival.